Chapter 41 of Dangerous Days by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Anna Klein stood in her small room and covered her mouth with her hands, lest she shriek aloud. She knew quite well that the bomb in the suitcase would not suffice to blow up the whole great plant, but she knew what the result of its explosion would be. The shells were not loaded at the Spencer plant. They were shipped away for that. But the fuses were loaded there, and in the small brick house at the end of the fuse building there were stored masses of explosive, enough to destroy a town. It was there, of course, that Herman was to place the bomb. She knew how he would do it, carefully, methodically, and with what a lumbering, awkward gait he would make his escape. Her whole mind was bent on giving the alarm. On escaping, first, and then on arousing the plant. But when the voices below continued, long after Herman had gone, she was entirely desperate. Herman had not carried out the suitcase. He had looked, indeed, much as usual as he walked out the garden path and closed the gate behind him. He had walked rather slowly, but then he always walked slowly. She seemed to see, however, a new caution in his gait, as of one who dreaded to stumble. She dressed herself with shaking fingers and pinned on her hat. The voices still went on below, monotonous, endless, the rasping of Rudolph's throat, irritated by cheap cigarettes, the sound of glasses on the table, once a laugh, guttural and mirthless. It was 10 o'clock when she knew, by the pushing back of their chairs, that they were preparing to depart. 10 o'clock. She was about to commence again the feverish unscrewing of the door hinges when she heard Rudolph's step on the stairs. She had only time to get to the back of her room, beside the bed, when she heard him try the knob. "Anna?" She let him call her again. "Anna?" "What is it?" "You in bed?" "Yes. Go away and let me alone. I've got a right to sleep, anyhow." "I'm going out, but I'll be back in 10 minutes. You try any tricks and I'll get you. See?" "You make me sick," she retorted. She heard him turn and run lightly down the stairs. Only when she heard the click of the gate did she dare to begin again at the door. She got downstairs easily, but she was still a prisoner. However, she found the high little window into the coal shed open, and crawled through it to stand listening. The street was quiet. Once outside the yard she started to run. They would let her telephone from the drugstore even without money. She had no money. But the drugstore was closed and dark, and the threat of Rudolph's return terrified her. She must get off the hill somehow. There were still paths down the steep hillside, dangerous things that hugged the edge of small rocky precipices, or sloped steeply to sudden turns. But she had played over the hill all her young life. She plunged down, slipping and falling a dozen times, and muttering sometimes an oath, sometimes a prayer. "Oh, God, let me be in time. Oh, God, hold him up a while I—" Then a slip. "If I fall now—" Only when she was down in the mill district did she try to make any plan. It was almost 11 then, and her ears were tense with listening for the sound she dreaded. She faced her situation then. She could not telephone from a private house either to the mill or to the Spencer house, what she feared, and the pay booths of the telephone company demanded cash in advance. She was incapable of clear thought, or she would have found some way out undoubtedly. What she did in the end was to board an uptown car and throw herself on the mercy of the conductor. "I've got to get uptown," she panted. "I'll not go in, see? I'll stand here and you take me as far as you can. Look at me. I don't look as though I'm just bumming a ride, do I?" The conductor hesitated. He had very little faith in human nature, but Anna's eyes were both truthful and desperate. He gave the signal to go on. "What's up?" he said. "Police after you?" "Yes," Anna replied briefly. There is, in certain ranks, a tacit conspiracy against the police. The conductor hated them. They rode free on his car, and sometimes kept an eye on him in the rush hours. They had a way, too, of letting him settle his own disputes with inebriated gentlemen who refused to pay their fares. "Looks as though they'd come pretty close to grabbing you," he opened by way of conversation. "But 10 of 'em aren't a match for one smart girl. They can't run. All got flat feet." Anna nodded. She was faint and dizzy. and the car seemed to creep along. It was 20 minutes after 11 when she got out. The conductor leaned down after her, hanging onto the handrail. "Good luck to you," he said. "And you'd better get a better face on you than that. It's enough to send you up on suspicion." She hardly heard him. She began to run, and again she said over and over again her little inarticulate prayer. She knew the Spencer house. More than once she had walked past it on Sunday afternoons for the sheer pleasure of seeing Graham's home. Well, all that was over now. Everything was over unless... The Spencer house was dark, save for a low light in the hall. A new terror seized her. Suppose Graham saw her. He might not believe her story. He might think it a ruse to see his father. But as it happened, Clayton had sent the butler to bed, and himself answered the bell from the library. He recognized her at once, and because he saw the distress on her face, he brought her in at once. In the brief moment that it required to turn on the lights, he had jumped to a sickening conviction that Graham was at the bottom of her visit, and her appearance in full light confirmed this. "Come into the library," he said. "We can talk in there." He led the way and drew up a chair for her. But she did not sit down. She steadied herself by its back instead. "You think it's about Graham," she began. "It isn't, not directly, that is. And my coming is terrible, because it's my own father. They're going to blow up the munition plant, Mr. Spencer." "When?" "Tonight, I think. I came as fast as I could. I was locked in." "Locked in?" He was studying her face. "Yes, don't bother about that now. I'm not crazy or hysterical. I tell you I heard them. I've been a prisoner or I'd have come sooner. Today they brought something, dynamite or a bomb in a suitcase, and it's gone tonight. He took it. My father." He was already at the telephone as she spoke. He called the mill first and got the night superintendent. Then he called a number Anna supposed was the police station, and at the same time he was ringing the garage signal steadily for his car. By the time he had explained the situation to the police, his car was rolling under the porte cochere beside the house. He was starting out, forgetful of the girl, when she caught him by the arm. "You mustn't go," she cried. "You'll be killed, too. It will all go. All of it. You can't be spared, Mr. Spencer. You can build another mill, but..." He shook her off gently. "Of course I'm going," he said. "We'll get it in time. Don't you worry. You sit down here and rest, and when it's all straightened out, I'll come back. I suppose you can't go home after this?" "No," she said dully. He ran out, hatless, and a moment later she heard the car rush out into the night. 5 minutes passed. 10. Anna Klein stood staring ahead of her. When nothing happened, she moved around and sank down in the chair. She was frightfully tired. She leaned her head back and tried to think of something to calm her shaking nerves. That this was Graham's home, that he sometimes sat in that very chair. But she found that Graham meant nothing to her. Nothing mattered, except that her warning had been in time. So intent was she on the thing she was listening for that smaller, nearby sounds escaped her. So she did not hear a door open upstairs and the soft rustle of a woman's negligee as it swept from stair to stair. But at the footsteps outside the door she stood up quickly and looked back over her shoulder. Natalie stood framed in the doorway, staring at her. "Well?" she said, and on receiving no answer from the frightened girl, "What are you doing here?" The ugly suspicion in her voice left Anna speechless for a moment. "Don't move, please," said Natalie's cold voice. "Stay just where you are." She reached behind the curtain at the doorway, and Anna heard the faraway ringing of a bell, insistent and prolonged. The girl roused herself with an effort. "I came to see Mr. Spencer." "That is a likely story. Who let you in?" "Mr. Spencer." "Mr. Spencer is not in." "But he did. I'm telling you the truth. Indeed I am. I rang the bell and he came to the door. I had something to tell him." "What could you possibly have to tell my husband at this hour?" But Anna Klein did not answer. From far away there came a dull report, followed almost immediately by a second one. The windows rattled and the house seemed to rock rather gently on its foundation. Then silence. Anna Klein picked up her empty pocketbook from the table and looked at it. "I was too late," she said dully, and the next moment she was lying at Natalie's feet. Chapter 42 of Dangerous Days by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. It was not until dawn that the full extent of the disaster was revealed. All night, by the flames from the sheds in the yard, which were of wood and still burning, rescue parties had worked frantically. 2 of the long buildings, nearest to the fuse department, had collapsed entirely. Above the piles of fallen masonry might be seen, here and there, the black mass of some machine or lathe, and it was there the search parties were laboring. Luckily, the fuse department had not gone double turn, and the night shift in the machine shop was not a full one. The fuse department was a roaring furnace, and repeated calls had brought in most of the fire companies of the city. Running back and forth at the light of the flames were the firemen and such volunteer rescuers as had been allowed through the police cordon. Outside that line of ropes and men were gathered a tragic crowd, begging, imploring to be allowed to search for some beloved body. Now and then a fresh explosion made the mob recoil, only to press close again, importuning, tragic, hopeless. The casualty list ran high. All night long ambulances stood in a row along the street, backed up to the curb and waiting, and ever so often a silent group, in broken step, carried out some quiet covered thing that would never move again. With the dawn, Graham found his father. He had thrown off his coat and in his shirt sleeves was, with other rescuers, digging in the ruins. Graham himself had been working. He was nauseated, weary, and unutterably wretched, for he had seen the night superintendent and had heard of his father's message. "Klein," he said. "You don't mean Herman Klein?" "That was what he said. I was to find him and hold him until he got here. But I couldn't find him. He may have got out. There's no way of telling now." Waves of fresh nausea swept over Graham. He sat down on a pile of bricks and wiped his forehead, clammy with sweat. "I hope to God he was burned alive," muttered the other man, surveying the scene. His eyes were reddened with smoke from the fire, his clothing torn. "I was knocked down myself," he said. "I was out in the yard looking for Klein, and I guess I lay there quite a while. If I hadn't gone out—" He shrugged his shoulders. "How many women were on the night shift?" "Not a lot, 20 perhaps. If I had my way I'd take every German in the country and boil 'em in oil. I didn't want Klein back, but he was a good workman. Well, he's done a good job now." It was after that Graham saw his father, a strange, wild-eyed Clayton who drove his pick with a sort of mad strength and at the same time gave orders in an unfamiliar voice. Graham, himself a disordered figure, watched him for a moment. He was divided between fear and resolution. Some place in that debacle there lay his own responsibility. He was still bewildered, but the fact that Anna's father had done the thing was ominous. The urge to confession was stronger than his fears. Somehow during the night he had become a man. But now he only felt that somehow during the night he had become a murderer. Clayton looked up and he moved toward him. "Yes?" "I've had some coffee made at a house down the street. Won't you come and have it?" Clayton straightened. He was very tired, and the yard was full of volunteers now, each provided at the gate with a pick or shovel. A look at the boy's face decided him. "I'll come," he said, and turned his pick over to the man beside him. He joined Graham, and for a moment he looked into the boy's eyes. Then he put a hand on his shoulder, and together they walked out, past the line of ambulances, into a street where the scattered houses showed not a single unshattered window, and the pavements were littered with glass. His father's touch comforted the boy, but it made even harder the thing he had to do. For he could not go through life with this thing on his soul. There had been a moment, after he learned of Herman's implication, when he felt the best thing would be to kill himself, but he had put that aside. It was too easy. If Herman Klein had done this because of Anna and himself, then he was a murderer. If he had done it because he was a German, then he, Graham, had no right to die. He would live to make as many Germans as possible pay for this night's work. "I've got something to tell you, father," he said, as they paused before the house where the coffee was ready. Clayton nodded, and together they went inside. Even this house was partially destroyed. A piece of masonry had gone through the kitchen, and standing on fallen bricks and plaster, a cheerful old woman was cooking over a stove which had somehow escaped destruction. "It's bad," she said to Graham as she poured the coffee into cups, "but it might have been worse, Mr. Spencer. We're all alive. And I guess I'll understand what my boy's writing home about now. They've sure brought the war here this night." Graham carried the coffee into the little parlor, where Clayton sat dropped on a low chair, his hands between his knees. He was a strange, disheveled figure, gray of face and weary, and the hand he held out for the cup was blistered and blackened. Graham did not touch his coffee. He put it on the mantel and stood waiting while Clayton finished his. "Shall I tell you now, sir?" Clayton drew a long breath. "It was Herman Klein who did it?" "Probably. I had a warning last night, but it was too late. I should have known, of course, but somehow I didn't. He'd been with us a long time. I'd have sworn he was loyal." For the first time in his life Graham saw his father weaken, the pitiful, ashamed weakness of a strong man. His voice broke, his face twitched. The boy drew himself up. They couldn't both go to pieces. He could not know that Clayton had worked all that night in that hell with the conviction that in some way his own son was responsible, that he knew already what Graham was about to tell him. "If Herman Klein did it, father, it was because he was the tool of a gang. And the reason he was a tool was because he thought I was living with Anna. I wasn't. I don't know why I wasn't. There was every chance. I suppose I meant to sometime. Anyhow, he thought I was." If he had expected any outbreak from Clayton, he met none. Clayton sat looking ahead and listening. Inside of the broken windows the curtains were stirring in the fresh breeze of early morning, and in the kitchen the old woman was piling the fallen bricks noisily. "I had been flirting with her a little. It wasn't much more than that, and I gave her a watch at Christmas. He found it out and he beat her, awfully. She ran away and sent for me, and I met her. She had to hide for days. Her face was all bruised. Then she got sick from it. She was sick for weeks." "Did he know where she was?" "I think not, or he'd have gone to get her. But Rudolph Klein knew something. I took her out to dinner to a roadhouse a few days ago, and she said she saw him there. I didn't. All that time, weeks, I'd never gone to her room. That night I did. I don't know why I—" "Go on." "Well, I went, but I didn't stay. I couldn't. I guess she thought I was crazy. I went away, that's all. And the next day I felt that she might be feeling as though I'd turned her down or something. And I felt responsible. Maybe you won't understand. I don't quite myself. Anyhow, I went back to let her know I wasn't quite a brute, even if— But she was gone. I'm not trying to excuse myself. It's a rotten story, for I was engaged to Marion then." Suddenly he sat down beside Clayton and buried his face in his hands. For some reason or other, Clayton found himself back in the hospital, that night when Joey lay still and quiet, and Graham was sobbing like a child, prostrate on the white covering of the bed. With the incredible rapidity of thought in a mental crisis, he saw the last months, the boy's desire to go to France thwarted, his attempt to interest himself in the business, the tool Marion Hayden had made of him, Anna's dog-like devotion, all leading inevitably to catastrophe. And through it all he saw Natalie, holding Graham back from war, providing him with extra money, excusing him, using his confidences for her own ends, insidiously sapping the boy's confidence in his father and himself. "We'll have to stand up to this together, Graham." The boy looked up. "Then you're not going to throw me over altogether?" "No." "But all this?" "If Herman Klein had not done it, there were others who would, probably. It looks as though you had provided them with a tool, but I suppose we were vulnerable in a dozen ways." He rose, and they stood, eyes level, father and son, in the early morning sunlight. And suddenly Graham's arms were around his shoulders, and something tight around Clayton's heart relaxed. Once again, and now for good, he had found his boy, the little boy who had not so long ago stood on a chair for this very embrace. Only now the boy was a man. "I'm going to France, father," he said. "I'm going to pay them back for this. And out of every 2 shots I fire, 1 will be for you." Perhaps he had found his boy only to lose him, but that would have to be as God willed. At 10 o'clock he went up to the house to change his wet and draggled clothing. The ruins were being guarded by soldiers, and the work of rescue was still going on, more slowly now, since there was little or no hope of finding any still living thing in that flame-swept wreckage. He found Natalie in bed with Madeleine in attendance, and he learned that her physician had just gone. He felt that he could not talk to her just then. She had a morbid interest in horrors, and with the sights of that night fresh in his mind, he could not discuss them. He stopped, however, in her doorway. "I'm glad you are resting," he said. "Better stay in bed today. It's been a shock." "Resting? I've been frightfully ill." "I'm sorry, my dear. I'll come in again on my way out." "Clay!" He turned in the doorway. "Is it all gone? Everything?" "Practically, yes." "But you were insured." "I'll tell you about that later. I haven't given it much thought yet. I don't know just how we stand." "I shall never let Graham go back to it again. I warn you, I've been lying here for hours, thinking that it might have happened as easily as not while he was there." He hardly listened. He had just remembered Anna. "I left a girl here last night, Natalie," he said. "Do you happen to know what became of her?" Natalie stirred on her pillows. "I should think I do. She fainted or pretended to faint. The servants looked after her." "Has she gone?" "I hope so. It is almost noon. Oh, by the way," she called, as he moved off, "there is a message for you. A woman named Gould from the Central Hospital. She wants to see you at once. They have kept the telephone ringing all the morning." Clare Gould. That was odd. He had seen her taken out, a bruised and moaning creature, her masses of fair hair over her shoulders, her eyes shut. The surgeons had said she was not badly hurt. She might be worse than they thought. The mention of her name brought Audrey before him. He hoped, wherever she was, she would know that he was all right. As soon as he had changed, he called the hospital. The message came back promptly and clearly. "We have a woman named Gould here. She is not badly hurt, but she is hysterical. She wants to see you, but if you can't come at once, I am to give you a message. Wait a moment. She has written it, but it's hardly legible." Clayton waited. "It's about somebody you know who had gone on night turn recently at your plant. I can't read the name. It looks like Ballantine." "It isn't Valentine, is it?" "Perhaps it is. It's just a scrawl. But the first name is clear enough. Audrey." Afterward he did not remember hanging up the receiver or getting out of the house. He seemed to come to himself somewhat at the hospital, and at the door to Clare's ward his brain suddenly cleared. He did not need Clare's story. It seemed that he knew it all, had known it long ages before. Her very words sounded like infinite repetitions of something he had heard over and over. "She was right beside me, and I was showing her about the lathe. They told me I could teach her. She was picking it up fast, too, and she liked it. She liked it." The fact that Audrey had liked it broke down his scanty reserve of restraint. Clayton found himself looking down at her from a great distance. She was very remote. Clare pulled herself together. "When the first explosion came, it didn't touch us. But I guess she knew it meant more. She said something about the telephone and getting help, and there'd be more, and she started to run. I stood there, watching her run, and waiting. And then the second one came and—" Suddenly Clare seemed to disappear altogether. He felt something catch his arm, and the nurse's voice, very calm and quiet. "Sit down. I'll get you something." Then he was swallowing a fluid that burned his throat, and Clare was crying with a sheet drawn to her mouth. And somewhere Audrey... He got up, and the nurse followed him out. "You might look for the person here," she suggested. "We have had several brought in." He was still dazed, but he followed her docilely. Audrey was not there. He seemed to have known that, too. That there would be a long search, and hours of agony, and at the end, the one thing he did not know was what was to be at the end. All that afternoon he searched, going from hospital to hospital, and at each one as he stopped that curious feeling of inner knowledge told him she was not there. But the same instinct told him she was not dead. He would have known it if she was dead. There was no reasoning in it. He could not reason. But he knew, somehow. Then, late in the afternoon, he found her. He knew that he had found her. It was as though, at the entrance of the hospital, some sixth sense had told him this was right at last. He was quite steady, all at once. She was here, waiting for him to come. And now he had come, and it would be all right. Yet for a time it seemed all wrong. She was not conscious, had not roused since she was brought in. There were white screens around her bed, and behind them she lay alone. They had braided her hair in two long dark braids, and there was a bandage on one of her arms. She looked very young and very tired, but quite peaceful. His arrival had caused a small stir of excitement, his own prominence, the disaster with which the country was ringing. But for a few minutes before the doctors arrived, he was alone with her behind the screen. It was like being alone with his dead. Bent over her, his face pressed to one of her quiet hands, he whispered to her all the little tendernesses, the aching want of her that so long he had buried in his heart. Things he could not have told her, waking, he told her then. It seemed, too, that she must rouse to them, that she must feel him there beside her, calling her back. But she did not move. It was then, for the first time, that he wondered what he would do if she should die. The doctors, coming behind the screen, found him sitting erect and still, staring ahead of him with a strange expression on his face. He had just decided that he could not, under any circumstances, live if she died. It was rather a good thing for Clayton's sanity that they gave him hope. He was completely unnerved, tired and desperate. Indeed, when they came in, he had been picturing Audrey and himself wandering hand in hand, very quietly and contentedly, in some strange world which was his rather hazy idea of the beyond. It seemed to him quite sane and extraordinarily happy. The effort of meeting the staff roused him, and with hope came a return to normality. There was much to be done, special nurses, a private room, and rather reluctantly, friends and relatives to be notified. Only for a few minutes, out of all of life, had she been his. He must give her up now. Life had become one long renunciation. He did not go home at all that night. He divided his time between the plant and the hospital, going back and forward. Each time he found the report good. She was still strong. No internal injuries had manifested themselves, and the concussion would probably wear off before long. He wanted to be there when she first opened her eyes. He was afraid she might be frightened, and there would be a bad minute when she remembered, if she did remember. At midnight, going into the room, he found Mrs. Haverford beside Audrey's bed, knitting placidly. She seemed to accept his being there as perfectly natural, and she had no sick-room affectations. She did not whisper, for one thing. "The nurse thinks she is coming round, Clayton," she said. "I waited because I thought she ought to see a familiar face when she does." Mrs. Haverford was eminently good for him. Her cheerful matter-of-factness, her competent sanity, restored his belief in a world that had seemed only chaos and death. How much, he wondered later, had Mrs. Haverford suspected? He had not been in any condition to act a part. But whatever she suspected, he knew was locked up in her kindly breast. Audrey moved slightly, and he went over to her. When he glanced up again, Mrs. Haverford had gone out. So it was that Audrey came back to him, and to him alone. She asked no questions. She only lay quite still on her white pillows and looked at him. Even when he knelt beside her and drew her toward him, she said nothing, but she lifted her uninjured hand and softly caressed his bent head. Clayton never knew whether Mrs. Haverford had come back and seen that or not. He did not care, for that matter. It seemed to him just then that all the world must know what was so vitally important, so transcendently wonderful. Not until Audrey's eyes closed again and he saw that she was sleeping did he loosen his arms from around her. When at last he went out to the stiffly furnished hospital parlor, he found Mrs. Haverford sitting there alone, still knitting. But he rather thought she had been crying. There was an undeniably moist handkerchief on her knee. "She roused a little while ago," he said, trying to speak quietly, and as though Audrey's rousing were not the wonder that it was. "She seemed very comfortable, and now she's sleeping." "The dear child!" said Mrs. Haverford. "If she had died after everything." Her plump face quivered. "Things have never been very happy for her, Clayton." "I'm afraid not." He went to a window and stood looking out. The city was not quiet, but its mighty roar of the day was lowered to a monotonous, drowsy humming. From the east, reflected against low-hanging clouds, was the dull red of his own steel mills, looking like the reflection of a vast conflagration. "Not very happy," he repeated. "Sometimes," Mrs. Haverford was saying, "I wonder about things. People go along missing the best things in life, and I suppose there is a reason for it, but sometimes I wonder if he ever meant us to go on, crucifying our own souls." So she did know. "What would you have us do?" "I don't know. I suppose there isn't any answer." Afterward Clayton found that that bit of conversation with Mrs. Haverford took on the unreality of the rest of that 24 hours. But one part of it stood out real and hopelessly true. There wasn't any answer. End of chapter 42. Chapter 43 of Dangerous Days by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Anna Klein had gone home at 3 o'clock that terrible morning, a trembling, white-faced girl. She had done her best, and she had failed. Unlike Graham, she had no feeling of personal responsibility, but she felt she could never again face her father with the thing that she knew between them. There were other reasons, too. Herman would be arrested, and she would be called to testify. She had known that. She had warned Mr. Spencer. The gang, Rudolph's gang, would get her for that. She knew where they were now. They would be at Gus's in the back room, drinking to the success of their scheme. And Gus, who was a German too, would be with them, offering a round of drinks on the house now and then as his share of the night's rejoicing. Gus, who was already arranging to help draft dodgers by sending them over the Mexican border. She would have to go back, to get in and out again if she could, before Herman came back. She had no clothes, except what she stood up in, and those in her haste that night were only her print house dress with a long coat. She would have to find a new position, and she would have to have her clothing to get about in. She dragged along, singularly unmolested. Once or twice a man eyed her, but her white face and vacant eyes were unattractive, almost sodden. She was barely able to climb the hill, and as she neared the house her trepidation increased. What if Herman had come back? If he suspected her, he would kill her. He must have been half mad to have done the thing anyhow. He would surely be half mad now. And because she was young and strong and life was still a mystery to be solved, she did not want to die. Strangely enough, face to face with danger, there was still in the back of her head an exultant thrill in her very determination to live. She would start over again, and she would work hard and make good. "You bet I'll make good," she resolved. "Just give me a chance and I'll work my fool head off." Which was by way of being a prayer. It was the darkest hour before the dawn when she reached the cottage. It was black and very still, and outside the gate she stooped and slipped off her shoes. The window into the shed by which she had escaped was still open, and she crouched outside, listening. When the stillness remained unbroken, she climbed in, tense for a movement or a blow. Once inside, however, she drew a long breath. The doors were still locked and the keys gone, so Herman had not returned. But as she stood there, hurried, stealthy footsteps came along the street and turned in at the gate. In a panic she flew up the stairs and into her room, where the door still hung crazily on its hinges. She stood there, listening, her heart pounding in her ears, and below she distinctly heard a key in the kitchen door. She did the only thing she could think of. She lifted the door into place and stood against it, bracing it with her body. Whoever it was in the kitchen now, moving, however, more swiftly than Herman. She heard matches striking, then, "Hist!" She knew that it was Rudolph, and she braced herself mentally. Rudolph was keener than Herman. If he found her door in that condition, and she herself dressed? Working silently and still holding the door in place, she flung off her coat. She even unpinned her hair and unfastened her dress. When his signal remained unanswered a second time, he called her by name, and she heard him coming up. "Anna," he repeated. "Yes?" He was startled to hear her voice so close to the door. In the dark she heard him fumbling for the knob. He happened on the padlock instead, and he laughed a little. By that she knew that he was not quite sober. "Locked you in, has he?" "What do you want?" "Has Herman come home yet?" "He doesn't get home until 7. "Hasn't he been back at all to night?" She hesitated. "How do I know? I've been asleep." "Some sleep," he said, and suddenly lurched against the door. In spite of her it yielded, and although she braced herself with all her strength, his weight against it caused it to give way. It was a suspicious, crafty Rudolph who picked himself up and made a clutch at her in the dark. "You little liar," he said thickly, and struck a match. She cowered away from him. "I was going to run away, Rudolph," she cried. "He hasn't any business locking me in. I won't stand for it." "You've been out." "No." "Out. After him." "Honest to God, Rudolph, no. I hate him. I don't ever want to see him again." He put a hand out into the darkness, and finding her, tried to draw her to him. She struggled, and he released her. All at once she knew that he was weak with fright. The bravado had died out of him. The face she had touched was covered with a clammy sweat. "I wish to God Herman would come." "What do you want with him?" "Have you got any whiskey?" "You've had enough of that stuff." Some one was walking along the street outside. She felt that he was listening, crouched, ready to run, but the steps went on. "Look here, Anna," he said, when he had pulled himself together again. "I'm going to get out of this. I'm going away." "All right. You can go for all of me." "Do you mean to say you've been asleep all night? You didn't hear anything?" "Hear what?" He laughed. "You'll know soon enough." Then he told her, hurriedly, that he was going away. He came back to get her to promise to follow him. He wasn't going to stay here and what? "And be drafted," he finished, rather lamely. "Gus has a friend in a town on the Mexican border," he said. "He's got maps of the country to Mexico City, and the Germans there fix you up all right. I'll get rich down there, and some day I'll send for you. What's that?" He darted to the window, faintly outlined by a distant street lamp. 3 men were standing quietly outside the gate, and a fourth was already in the garden, silently moving toward the house. She felt Rudolph brush by her, and the trembling hand he laid on her arm. "Now lie," he whispered fiercely. "You haven't seen me. I haven't been here to night." Then he was gone. She ran to the window. The other 3 men were coming in, moving watchfully and slowly, and Rudolph was at Katie's window, cursing. If she was a prisoner, so was Rudolph. He realized that instantly, and she heard him breaking out the sash with a chair. At the sound, the 3 figures broke into a run, and she heard the sash give way. Almost instantly there was firing. The first shot was close, and she knew it was Rudolph firing from the window. Some wild design of braining him from behind with a chair flashed into her desperate mind, but when she had felt her way into Katie's room he had gone. The garden below was quiet, but there was yelling and the crackling of underbrush from the hillside. Then a scattering of shots again, and silence. The yard was empty. The hill paid but moderate attention to shots. They were usually merely pyrotechnic, and indicated rejoicing rather than death. But here and there she heard a window raised and then lowered again. The hill had gone back to bed. Anna went into her room and dressed. For the first time it had occurred to her that she might be held by the police, and the thought was unbearable. It was when she was making her escape that she found a prostrate figure in the yard, and knew that one of Rudolph's shots had gone home. She could not go away and leave that, not unless... A terrible hatred of Herman and Rudolph and all their kind suddenly swept over her. She would not run away. She would stay and tell all the terrible truth. It was her big moment, and she rose to it. She would see it through. What was her own safety to letting this band of murderers escape? And all that in the few seconds it took to reach the fallen figure. It was only when she was very close that she saw it was moving. "Tell Dunbar he went to the left," a voice was saying. "The left. They'll lose him yet." "Joey." "Hello," said Joey's voice. He considered that he was speaking very loud, but it was hardly more than a whisper. "That wasn't your father, was it? The old boy couldn't jump and run like that." "Are you hurt?" He coughed a little, a gurgling cough that rather startled himself. But he was determined to be a man. "No, I just lay down here for a nap. Who was it that jumped?" "My cousin Rudolph. Do you think I can help you into the house?" "I'll walk there myself in a minute. Unless your cousin Rudolph..." His head dropped back on her arm. "I feel sort of all in." His voice trailed off. "Joey!" "Let me alone," he muttered. "I'm the first casualty in the American army. He made a desperate effort to speak in a man's voice, but the higher boyish notes of 16 conquered. "They certainly gave us hell to night, but we're going to build again. Me and Clayton spent..." All at once he was very still. Anna spoke to him, and that failing, gave him a frantic little shake. But Joey had gone to another partnership beyond the stars. End of chapter 43. Chapter 44 of Dangerous Days by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. The immediate outstanding result of the Holocaust at the munitions works was the end of Natalie's dominion over Graham. She never quite forgave him the violence with which he threw off her shackles. "If I'd been half a man, I'd have been over there long ago," he said, standing before her, tall and young and flushed. "I'd have learned my job by now, and I'd be worth something, now I'm needed." "And broken my heart." "Hearts don't break that way, Mother." "Well, you say you are going now. I should think you'd be satisfied. There's plenty of time for you to get the glory you want." "Glory? I don't want any glory. And as for plenty of time, that's exactly what there isn't." During the next few days she preserved an obstinate silence on the subject. She knew he had been admitted to one of the officers' training camps, and that he was making rather helpless and puzzled purchases. Going into his room, she would find a dressing case of khaki leather, perhaps, or flannel shirts of the same indeterminate hue. She would shed futile tears over them and order them put out of sight. But she never offered to assist him. Graham was older in many ways. He no longer ran up and down stairs whistling, and he sought every opportunity to be with his father. They spent long hours together in the library, when after a crowded day, filled with the 1,000 problems of reconstructions, Clayton smoked a great deal, talked a little, rather shamefacedly, after the manner of men, of personal responsibility in the war, and quietly watched the man who was Graham. Out of those quiet hours, with Natalie at the theater or reading upstairs in bed, Clayton got the greatest comfort of his life. He would neither look back nor peer anxiously ahead. The past, with its tragedy, was gone. The future might hold even worse things. But just now he would live each day as it came, working to the utmost, and giving his evenings to his boy. The nights were the worst. He was not sleeping well, and in those long hours of quiet he tried to rebuild his life along stronger, sterner lines. Love could have no place in it, but there was work left. He was strong and he was still young. The country should have every ounce of energy in him. He would rebuild the plant on bigger lines than before, and when that was done he would build again. The best he could do was not enough. He scarcely noticed Natalie's withdrawal from Graham and himself. When she was around he was his old punctilious self, gravely kind, more than ever considerate. Beside his failure to her, her own failure to him faded into insignificance. She was as she was, and through no fault of hers, but he was what he had made himself. Once or twice he had felt an overwhelming remorse toward her, and on one such occasion he had made a useless effort to break down the barrier of her long silence. "Don't go upstairs, Natalie," he had begged. "I'm not very amusing, I know, but I'll try my best. I'll promise not to touch on anything disagreeable." He had been standing in the hall, looking up at her on the staircase, and he smiled. There was pleading behind the smile, an inarticulate feeling that between them there might at least be friendship. "You are never disagreeable," she had said, looking down with hostile eyes. "You are quite perfect." "Then won't you wait?" "Perfection bores me to tears," she said, and went on up the stairs. On the morning of Graham's departure, however, he found her prepared to go to the railway station. She was red-eyed and pale, and he was very sorry for her. "Do you think it is wise?" he asked. "I shall see him off, of course. I may never see him again." And his own tautened nerves almost gave way. "Don't say that," he cried. "Don't even think that. And for God's sake, Natalie, send him off with a smile. That's the least we can do." "I can't take it as casually as you do." He gave up then, in despair. He saw that Graham watched her uneasily during the early breakfast, and he surmised that the boy's own grip on his self-control was weakened by the tears that dropped into her coffee cup. He reflected bitterly that all over the country strong women, good women, were sending their boys away to war, giving them with prayer and exaltation. What was wrong with Natalie? What was wrong with his whole life? When Graham was upstairs he turned to her. "Why do you persist in going, Natalie?" "I intend to go. That's enough." "Don't you think you've made him unhappy enough?" "He has made me unhappy enough." "You! It is always yourself, Natalie. Why don't you ever think of him?" He went to the door. "Countermand the order for the limousine," he said to the butler, "and order the small car for Mr. Graham and myself." "How dare you do that?" "I am not going to let you ruin the biggest day in his life." She saw that he meant it. She was incredulous, reckless, angry, and thwarted for the first time in her self-indulgent life. "I hate you," she said slowly. "I hate you." She turned and went slowly up the stairs. Graham, knocking at her door a few minutes later, heard the sound of hysterical sobbing within, but received no reply. "Good-bye, Mother," he called. "Good-bye. Don't worry. I'll be all right." When he saw she did not mean to open the door or to reply, he went rather heavily down the stairs. "I wish she wouldn't," he said. "It makes me darned unhappy." But Clayton surmised a relief behind his regret, and in the train the boy's eyes were happier than they had been for months. "I don't know how I'll come out, Dad," he said, "but if I don't get through it, it won't be because I didn't try." And he did try. The enormous interest of the thing gripped him from the start. There was romance in it, too. He wore his first uniform, too small for him as it was, with immense pride. He rolled out in the morning at reveille, with the feeling that he had just gone to bed, ate hugely at breakfast, learned how to make his own cot bed, and lined up on a vast dusty parade ground for endless evolutions in a boiling sun. It was rather amusing to find himself being ordered about in a stentorian voice by Jackson. And when, in off moments, that capable ex-chauffeur condescended to a few moments of talk and relaxation, the boy was highly gratified. "Do you think I've got anything in me?" he would inquire anxiously. And Jackson always said heartily, Sure you have." There were times when Graham doubted himself, however. There was one dreadful hour when Graham, in the late afternoon, and under the eyes of his commanding officer and a group of ladies, conducting the highly formal and complicated ceremony of changing the guard, tied a lot of grinning men up in a knot which required the captain of the company and two sergeants to untangle. "I'm no earthly good," he confided to Jackson that night, sitting on the steps of his barracks. "I know it like ABC, and then I get up and try it, and all at once I'm just a plain damned fool." "Don't give up like that, son," Jackson said. "I've seen him march a platoon right into the C.O.'s porch before now. And once I just saved a baby buggy and a pair of twins." Clayton wrote him daily, and now and then there came a letter from Natalie, cheerful on the surface, but its cheerfulness obviously forced. And once, to his great surprise, Marion Hayden wrote him. "I just want you to know," she said, "that I am still interested in you, even going to be anything else, and that I am ridiculously proud of you. Isn't it queer to look back on last winter and think what a lot of careless idiots we were? I suppose war doesn't really change us, but it does make us wonder what we've got in us. I am surprised to find that I am a great deal better than I ever thought I was." There was comfort in the letter, but no thrill. He was far away from all that now, like one on the first stage of a long journey, with his eyes ahead. Then one day he saw a familiar but yet strange figure striding along the country road. Graham was map sketching that day, and the strange but familiar figure was almost on him when he looked up. It was extremely military, and looked like a general at least. Also, it was very red in the face, and was clutching doggedly in its teeth an old briar pipe. But what had appeared from the front to be an ultra-military figure, on closer inspection turned out to be a procession. Pulling back hard on a rope behind was the company goat, Eleanor. The ultra-military figure paused by Graham's sketching stool and said, "Young man, do you know where this creature belongs? I found her trying to commit suicide on the rifle range. Why, Graham!" It was Doctor Haverford. He grew a trifle less military then, and borrowed some pipe tobacco. He looked oddly younger, Graham thought, and rather self-conscious of his uniform. "Every inch a soldier, Graham," he chuckled. "Still have to use a hook and eye at the bottom of the coat. Blouse," he corrected himself. "But I'm getting my waistline again. How's the whoa," he called, as Eleanor wrapped the rope around his carefully putted legs. "Infernal animal," he grumbled. "I just paid $25 to have these puttees shined. How's the family?" "Mother's gone to Linndale. The house is finished. Have you been here long, sir?" "2 weeks. Hang it all, Graham, I wish I'd let this creature commit suicide. She's Do you know Delight is here?" "Here? Why, no." "At the hostess house," said the chaplain proudly. "Doing her bit, too. Mrs. Haverford wanted to come, too, and sew buttons on, or something, but I told her 2 out of 3 was a fair percentage. I hear that Washington has sent for your father." "I hadn't heard." "He's a big man, Graham. We're going to hear from him. Only I thought he looked tired when I saw him last. Somebody ought to look after him a bit." He was patiently untangling himself from Eleanor's rope. "You know, there are 2 kinds of people in the world. Those who look after themselves, and those who look after others. That's your father. The last." Graham's face clouded. How true that was. He knew now as he had not known before. He was thinking clearly those days. Hard work and nothing to drink had clarified his mind, and he saw things at home as they really were. Clayton's infinite patience, his strength, and his gentleness. But he only said, "He has had a hard year." He raised his eyes and looked at the chaplain. "I didn't help him any, you know, sir." "Well, well, that's all over now. We've just one thing to think of, and that's to beat those German devils back to Berlin. And then burn Berlin," he added militarily. The last Graham saw of him, he was dragging Eleanor down the road, and a faint throaty humming came back, which sounded suspiciously like, "Where do we go from here, boys? Where do we go from here?" Candidate Spencer took great pains with his toilet that afternoon. He polished his shoes and shaved, and he spent a half hour on some 10 sadly neglected fingernails. At retreat he stood at attention in the long line and watched the flag moving slowly and majestically to the stirring bugle notes. Something swelled almost to bursting in his throat. That was his flag. He was going to fight for it. And after that was done he was going to find some girl, some nice girl, the sort, for instance, that would leave her home to work in a hostess house. And having found her, he would marry her and love and cherish her all his life. Unless, of course, she wouldn't have him. He was inclined to think she wouldn't. He ate very little supper that night, little being a comparative term, of course. And then he went to discover Delight. It appeared, however, that she had been already discovered. She was entirely surrounded by uniforms, and Graham furiously counted a colonel, 2 majors, and a captain. Pulling rank, of course, he muttered, and retired to a corner where he had at least the mild gratification of seeing that even the colonel could not keep Delight from her work. Silly asses, said Graham again. And then she saw him. There was no question about her being pleased. She was quite flushed with it, but a little uncomfortable, too, at Graham's attitude. He was oddly humble, yet he had a look of determination that was almost grim. She filled in a rather disquieting silence by trying to let him know, without revealing that she had ever been anything else, how proud she was of him. Then she realized that he was not listening, and that he was looking at her with an almost painful intensity. "When can you get away, Delight?" he asked abruptly. "From here?" She cast an appraising glance over the room. "Right away, I think. Why?" "Because I want to talk to you, and I can't talk to you here." She brought a bright colored sweater, and he helped her into it, still with his mouth set and his eyes a trifle sunken. All about there were laughing groups of men in uniform. Outside the parade glowed faintly in the dusk, and from the low barrack windows there came the glow of lights, the movement of young figures, voices, the thin metallic notes of a mandolin. "How strange it all is," Delight said. "Here we are, you and father and myself, and even Jackson, I saw him to day. All here, living different lives, doing different things, even thinking different thoughts. It's as though we had all moved into a different world." He walked on beside her, absorbed in his own thoughts, which were yet only of her. "I didn't know you were here," he brought out finally. "That's because you've been burying yourself. I knew you were here." "Why didn't you send me some word?" She stiffened somewhat in the darkness. "I didn't think you would be greatly interested, Graham." And again, struggling with his new humility, he was silent. It was not until they had crossed the parade ground and were beyond the noises of the barracks that he spoke again. "Do you mind if I talk to you, Delight? I mean, about myself? Since you're here, we're likely to see each other now and then, if you are willing. And I'd like to start straight." "Do you really want to tell me?" "No, but I've got to. That's all." He told her. He made no case for himself. Indeed, some of it Delight understood far better than he did himself. He said nothing against Marion. On the contrary, he blamed himself rather severely. And behind his honest, halting sentences, Delight read his own lack of understanding. She felt infinitely older than this tall, honest-eyed boy in his stained uniform, older and more sophisticated. But if she had understood the Marion Hayden situation, she was totally at a loss as to Anna. "But I don't understand," she cried. "How could you make love to her if you didn't love her?" "I don't know. Fellows do those things. It's just mischief. Some sort of a devil in them, I suppose." When he reached the beating and Anna's flight, however, she understood a little better. "Of course you had to stand by her," she agreed. "You haven't heard it all," he said quietly. "When I'm through, if you get up and leave me, I'll understand, Delight. And I won't blame you." He told her the rest of the story in a voice strained with anxiety. It was as though he had come to a tribunal for judgment. He spared her nothing. The dinner at the roadhouse with Rudolph at the window, his visit to Anna's room, and her subsequent disappearance. She told the Department of Justice people that Rudolph found her that night and took her home. She was a prisoner then, poor little kid. But she overheard her father and Rudolph plotting to blow up the mill. That's where I came in, Delight. He was crazy at me. He was a German, of course, and he might have done it anyhow. But Rudolph told him a lot of lies about me, and he did it. When I think about it all, and about Joey, I'm crazy." She slipped her hand over his. "Of course they would have done it anyhow," she said softly. "You aren't going to get up and go away?" "Why should I?" she asked. "I only feel oh, Graham, how wretched you must have been." Something in her voice made him sit up straighter. He knew now that it had always been Delight. Always. Only she had been too good for him. She had set a standard he had not hoped to reach. But now things were different. He hadn't amounted to much in other things, but he was a soldier now. He meant to be a mighty good soldier. And when he got his commission, "You won't mind, then, if I come in to see you now and then?" "Mine? Why, Graham." "And you don't think I'm quite hopeless, do you?" There were tears in her eyes, but she answered bravely. "I believe in you every minute. But then, I think I always have." "Like fun you have." But although he laughed, it was a shaky laugh. Suddenly he stood up and shook himself. He felt young and strong and extremely happy. There had been a bad time, but it was behind him now. Ahead there lay high adventure, and here, beside him in the dusk, was the girl of his heart. She believed in him. Work to do, and a woman who believed in a fellow. That was life. "Aren't you cold?" he asked, and drew the gaudy sweater tenderly around her shoulders. End of chapter 44. Chapter 45 of Dangerous Days by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. The fact that Audrey Valentine, conspicuous member of a conspicuous social group that she was, had been working in the machine shop of the Spencer Munitions Works at the time of the explosion was in itself sufficient to rouse the greatest interest. When a young reporter, gathering human interest stories about the event from the pitiful wreckage in the hospitals, happened on Clare Gould, he got a feature story for the Sunday edition that made Audrey's own world, reading it in bed or over its exquisite breakfast tables, gasp with amazement. For following up Clare's story, he found that Audrey had done much more than run toward the telephone. She had reached it, had found the operator gone, and had succeeded, before the roof fell in on her, in calling the fire department and in sending in a general alarm to all the hospitals. The reporter found the night operator who had received the message. He got a photograph of her, too, and from the society file, an old one of Audrey, very delicate and audacious, and not greatly resembling the young woman who lay in her bed and read the article aloud, between dismay and laughter, to old Terry Mackenzie. "Good heavens, Terry," she said. "Listen. I had heard the explosion, but did not, of course, know what it was. And then I got a signal, and it was the Spencer plant. A sweet southern voice said very calmly, 'Operator, this is important. Listen carefully. There has been an explosion at the Spencer plant and the ruins are on fire. There will probably be more explosions in a minute. Send in a general fire alarm and then get all the ambulances and doctors.' Then there was another explosion and their lines went out of commission. I am glad she is not dead. She certainly had her nerve." "Fame at last, Audrey," said old Terry, very gently. "It's shameless." But she was a little pleased, nevertheless. Not at the publicity. That was familiar enough. But that, when her big moment came, she had met it squarely. Terry was striding about the room. His visits were always rather cyclonic. He moved from chair to chair, leaving about each one an encircling ring of cigarette ashes, and carefully inspecting each new vase of flowers. He stopped in front of a basket of exquisite small orchids. "Who sent this?" he demanded. "Rodney Page. Doesn't it look like him?" He turned and stared at her. "What's come over Clayton Spencer? Is he blind?" "Blind?" "About Rodney. He's head over heels in love with Natalie Spencer. God alone knows why." "I dare say it isn't serious. He is always in love with somebody." "There's a good bit of talk. I don't give a hang for either of them, but I'm fond of Clayton. So are you. Natalie's out in the country now, and Rodney is there every week end. It's a scandal, that's all. As for Natalie herself, she ought to be interned as a dangerous pacifist. She's a martyr in her own eyes. Thank heaven there aren't many like her." Audrey leaned back against her pillows. "I wonder, Terry," she said, "if you haven't shown me what to do next. I might be able to reach some of the women like Natalie. There are some of them, and they've got to learn that if they don't stand behind the men, we're lost." "Fine," he agreed. "Get 'em to knit less and write more letters, cheerful letters. Tell 'em to remember that by the time their man gets the letter the baby's tooth will be through. There are a good many men in the army camps to day vicariously cutting teeth. Get after 'em, Audrey. A worried man is a poor soldier." After he had gone she had the nurse bring her paper and pencil, and she wrote, rather incoherently it is true, her first appeal to the women of the country. It was effective, too. Audrey was an effective person. When Clayton came for his daily visit she had just finished it, and was reading it over with considerable complacency. "I've become an author, Clay," she said. "I think myself I'm terribly good at it. May I read it to you?" He listened gravely, but with a little flicker of amusement in his eyes. How like her it was to refuse to allow herself even time to get entirely well. But when she finished he was thoughtful. She had called it "slacker women." That's what Natalie was. He had never put it into words before. Natalie was a slacker. He had never discussed Natalie's attitude toward the war with Audrey. He rather thought she was entirely ignorant of it. But her little article, glowing with patriotism, frank, simple, and convincing, might have been written to Natalie herself. "It is very fine," he said. "I rather think you have found yourself at last. There aren't a lot of such women, and I dare say there will be fewer all the time. But they exist, of course." She glowed under his approval. There was, in all their meetings, a subcurrent of sadness, that they must be so brief, that before long they must end altogether, that they could not put into words the things that were in their eyes and their hearts. After that first hour of a return to consciousness there had been no expressed tenderness between them. The nurse sat in the room, eternally knitting, and Clayton sat near Audrey, or read to her, or, like Terry, wandered about the room. But now and then Audrey, enthroned like a princess on her pillows, would find his eyes on her, and such a hungry look in them that she would clench her hands. And after such times she always said, "Now tell me about the mill." Or about Washington, where he was being summoned with increasing frequency, or about Graham, anything to take that look out of his eyes. He told her all his plans. He even brought the blueprints of the new plant and spread them out on the bed. He was dreaming a great dream those days, and Audrey knew it. He was building again, this time not for himself, but for the nation. After he had gone, looking boyish and reluctant, she would lie for a little while watching the door. Perhaps he had forgotten something and would come back. One day he did, and was surprised to find her suddenly in tears. "You came back," she said, half hysterically. "You came back." That was the only time in all those weeks that he kissed her. The nurse had gone out, and suddenly he caught her in his arms and held her to him. He put her back very gently, and she saw that he was pale. "I think I'd better go now and not come back," he said. And for 2 long, endless days he did not come. Then, on the third he came, very stiff and formal, and with himself well in hand. Audrey, leaning back and watching him, felt what a boy he was after all, so determined to do the right thing, so obvious with his blueprints, and so self-conscious. In June she left the hospital and went to the country. She had already made a little market for her work, and she wanted to carry it on. By that time, too, she knew that the break must come between Clayton and herself, if it came at all. "No letters, no anything, Clay," she said, and he acquiesced quietly. But the night she left, the butler, coming downstairs to investigate a suspicious sound, found him restlessly pacing the library floor. In August he went abroad, and sometime about the middle of the month, while he was in London, he received a cable from Graham. He had been commissioned a first lieutenant in the infantry. Clayton had been seeing war at first hand then, and for a few moments he was fairly terrified. On the 1st of August the Germans had used liquid fire for the first time, thus adding a new horror. Men in the trenches swept by it had been practically annihilated. Attacks against it were practically suicide. Already the year had seen the last of Kitchener's army practically destroyed, and the British combing the country for new divisions. In the deadly give and take of that summer, where gains and losses were measured by yards, the advantage was steadily on the German side, and it would be a year before the small force of American regulars could be augmented to any degree by the great new army. It was the darkest hour. Following on the heels of Graham's cable came a hysterical one from Natalie. "Graham probably ordered abroad. Implore you use influence with Washington." He resorted to his old remedy when he was in trouble. He walked the streets. He tried to allow for Natalie's lack of exaltation by the nature of her life. If she could have seen what he had seen, surely she would have felt, as he did, that no sacrifice could be too great to end this cancer of the world. But deep in his heart he knew that Natalie was Natalie. Nothing would change her. As it happened, he passed Graham on the Atlantic. There was a letter for him at the office, a boyish, exultant letter. "Dad, dear, I'm married," it began. "Married and off for France. It is Delight, of course. It was always Delight, although I know that sounds queer. And now I'm off to kill a Hun or two. More than that, I hope. I want 2 Germans for every poor devil they got at the works. That's the minimum. The maximum? You'll look after Delight, I know. She has been perfectly bully, but it's hard on her. We were married 2 days ago, and already I feel as though I've always been married. She's going on with the canteen work, and I shall try not to be jealous. She's popular. And if you'd seen the General when we were married, you'd have thought he was losing a daughter. I wired Mother, but she was too cut up about my leaving to come. I wish she had, for it was a strange sort of wedding. The division was about to move, and at the last minute 5 girls turned up to be married to fellows who were leaving. They came from all over, and believe me, there was some excitement. All day the General and Chaplain Haverford were fussing about licenses, and those girls sat around and waited and looked droopy, but sort of happy. You know what I mean. It was 9 o'clock in the evening before everything was ready. Delight had trimmed up the little church which is in the camp, and had a flag over the altar. Then we had a multiple wedding. Honestly. The organ played a squeaky wedding march, and we went in, 6 couples. The church was full of soldiers, and, I don't mind saying, I was ready to shed tears. We lined up, and Dr. Haverford married us. Delight says she is sure we are only 1/6 married. Quiet? You never heard such quiet, except for the General blowing his nose. I think myself he was weeping, and there was a rumor about the camp to that effect. You know, the flag over the altar and all that. I tell you, it made a fellow think. Well, I'm going over now. Quick work, isn't it? And to think that a few months ago I was hanging around the club and generally making a mess of life. That's all over now, thank God. I'm going to make good. Try to buck Mother up. It's pretty hard for her. It's hard for all women just waiting. And while I know I'm coming back safe and sound, I'd like to feel that you are going to keep an eye on Delight. She's the most important thing in the world to me now." Then scrawled in a corner he had added, "You've been mighty fine with me always, Dad. I was a good bit of a pup last winter. If I make anything of myself at all, it will be because I want to be like you." Clayton sat for a long time with the letter in his hand. The happiness and hope that fairly radiated from it cheered and warmed him. He was nearly happy. And it came to him then that while every man had the right to happiness, only those achieved it who craved it for others, and having craved it for them, at last saw the realization of their longing. End of chapter 45. Chapter 46 of Dangerous Days by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Natalie had had a dull spring. With Graham's departure for camp, she moved to the country house, carrying with her vast amounts of luggage, the innumerable things, large and small, which were necessary for her comfort. The installing of herself in her new and luxurious rooms gave her occupation for several days. She liked her new environment. She liked herself in it. The rose-colored taffetas of her bedroom brought out the delicacy of her skin. The hangings of her bed, small and draped, reflected a faint color into her face, and the morning inspection with a hand mirror, which always followed her coffee, showed her at her best instead of her worst. Of her dressing room she was not so sure. Its ivory paneled walls, behind whose sliding panels were hung her gowns, her silk and satin chiffon negligees, her wraps and summer furs, all the vast paraphernalia with which she armed herself as a knight with armor. The walls seemed cold. She hated old Blue, but old Blue Rodney had insisted upon. He had held a bit of the taffeta to her cheek. "It is delicious, Natalie," he said. "It makes your eyes as blue as the sea." "Always a decorator," she had replied, smiling. And standing in her blue room the first day of her arrival, and frowning at her reflection, she remembered his reply. "Because I have no right with you to be anything else." He had stopped a moment, and had absently folded and refolded the bit of blue silk. Suddenly he said, "What do you think I'm going to do now that our work together is done? Have you ever thought about that, Natalie?" "You are coming often to enjoy your handiwork." He had made an impulsive gesture. "I'm not coming. I've been seeing too much of you as it is. If you want the truth, I'm just wretchedly unhappy, Natalie. You know I'm in love with you, don't you?" "I believe you think you are." "Don't laugh," he almost snarled. "I may laugh at my idiocy, but you haven't any right to. I know I'm ridiculous. I've known it for months. But it's pretty serious for me." He had meant it. There could be no doubt of that. It is the curious quality of very selfish women that they inspire a certain sort of love. They are likely to be loved often, even though the devotion they inspire is neither deep nor lasting. Big and single-hearted women are loved by one man, and that forever. Natalie had not laughed, but she had done what was almost as bad. She had patted him on the arm. "Don't talk like that," she said gently. "You are all I have now, Rodney, and I don't want to lose you. I'm suffering horribly these days. You're my greatest comfort." "I've heard you say that of a chair." "As for loving me, you must not talk like that. Under the circumstances, it's indelicate." "Oh!" he had said, and looked at her quickly. "I can love you, but it's indelicate to tell you about it?" "I am married, Rodney." "Good God, do you think I ever forget it?" There was a real change in their relationship, but neither of them understood it. The change was that Rodney was no longer playing. Little by little he dropped his artistic posing for her benefit, his cynical cleverness, his adroit simulation of passion. He no longer dramatized himself, because rather often he forgot himself entirely. His passion had ceased to be spurious, and it was none the less real because he loved not a real woman, but one of his own artistic creation. He saw in Natalie a misunderstood and suffering woman, bearing the burdens he knew of with dignity and a certain beauty. And behind her slightly theatrical silences he guessed at other griefs, nobly borne and only gently intimated. He developed, after a time, a certain suspicion of Clayton, not of his conduct, but of his character. These big men were often hard. It was that quality which made them successful. They married tender, gentle girls, and then repressed and trampled on them. Natalie became, in his mind, a crushed and broken thing, infinitely lonely and pathetic. And without in the least understanding, Natalie instinctively knew it was when she was wistful and dependent that he found her most attractive, and became wistful and dependent to a point that imposed even on herself. "I've been very selfish with you, Rodney, dear," she said, lifting sad eyes to his. I am going to be better. You must come often this summer, and I'll have some nice girls for you to play with." "Thank you," he said stiffly. "We'll have to be as gay as we can," she sighed. "I'm just a little dreary these days, you know." It was rather absurd that they were in a shop, and that the clerk should return just then with certain chords, and that the discussion of certain shades of yellow made an anticlimax to it all. But in the car, later, he turned to her roughly. "You needn't ask any girls for me," he said. "I only want one woman, and if I can't have her, I don't want any one." At first, the very fact that he could not have her had been, unconsciously, the secret of her attraction. She was a perfect thing and unattainable. He could sigh for her with longing and perfect safety. But as time went on, with that incapacity of any human emotion to stand still, but either to go on or to go back, his passion took on a more human and less poetic aspect. She satisfied him less, and he wanted more. For one thing, he dreamed that strange dream of mankind, of making ice burn, of turning snow to fire. The old chimera of turning the cold woman to warmth through his own passion began to obsess him. Sometimes he watched Natalie and had strange fancies. He saw her lit from within by a fire, which was not the reflection of his, but was recklessly her own. How wonderful she would be, he thought. And at those times he had wild visions of going away with her into some beautiful wilderness, and there teaching her what she had missed in life. But although now he always wanted her, he was not always thinking of a wilderness. It was in his own world that he wanted her, to fit beautifully into his house, to move exquisitely dressed through ballrooms beside him. He wanted her, at those times, as the most perfect of all his treasures. He was still a collector. The summer only served to increase his passion. During the long hot days when Clayton was abroad or in Washington, or working late at night, as he frequently did now, they were much together. Natalie's plans for gayety had failed dismally. The city and the country houses near were entirely lacking in men. She found it a real grievance. "I don't know what we are coming to," she complained. "The country club is like a girls' boarding school. I wish to heaven the war was over and things were sensible again." So during his week-end visits they spent most of the time together. There were always girls there, and now and then a few men, who always explained immediately that they had been turned down for the service, or were going in the fall. "I'm sure somebody has to stay home and attend to things here," she said to him one August night. "But even when they are in America they are rushing about, pretending to do things. One would think, to see Clayton, that he is the entire government. It's absurd." "I wish I could go," he said unexpectedly. "Don't be idiotic. You're much too old." "Not as old as Clay." "Oh, Clay, he's in a class by himself." She laughed lightly. "Where is he now?" "In France, I think. Probably telling them how to run the war." "When is he coming back?" "I don't know. What do you mean by wishing you could go?" "Do you want me to tell you the truth?" "Not if it's disagreeable." "Well, I will, and it's not very agreeable. I can't keep this up, Natalie. I can't keep on coming here, being in Clayton's house and eating his bread, while I'm in love with his wife. It isn't decent." He flung away his cigaret and bent forward. "Don't you see that?" he asked gently. "Not while he is working for the country and Graham is abroad." "I don't see why war needs to deprive me of my friends. I've lost everything else." His morals were matters of his private life, and they had been neither better nor worse than the average. But he had breeding and a sure sense of the fitness of things, and this present week-end visit, with the ostentatious care the younger crowd took to allow him time to see Natalie alone, was galling to him. It put him in a false position, what hurt more, perhaps, in an unfavorable light. The war had changed standards, too. Men were being measured, especially by women, and those who failed to measure up were being eliminated with cruel swiftness, especially the men who stayed at home. With all this, too, there was a growing admiration for Clayton Spencer in their small circle. His name had been mentioned in connection with an important position in Washington. In the clubs there was considerable praise and some envy, and Rodney knew that his affair with Natalie was the subject of much invidious comment. "Do you love him?" he asked suddenly. Why, of course I do." "Do you mean that?" "I don't see what that has to do with our friendship." "Oh, friendship, you know how I feel, and yet you go on bringing up that silly word. If you love him, you don't love me, and yet you've let me hang around all these months, knowing I am mad about you. You don't play the game, Natalie." "What do you want to say?" "If you don't love Clayton, why don't you tell him so? He's honest enough. And I miss my guess if he wants a wife who cares for somebody else." She sat in the dusk, thinking, and he watched her. She looked very lovely in the setting which he himself had designed for her. She hated change, she loathed trouble of any sort, and she was, those days, just a little afraid of that strange, quiet Clayton who seemed eternally engrossed in war and the things of war. She glanced about, at the white trellises that gleamed in the garden, at the silvery fleur de lis which was the fountain, at all the lovely things with which Clayton's wealth had allowed her to surround herself. And suddenly she knew she could not give them up. "I don't see why you have to spoil everything," she said fretfully. "It had been so perfect. Of course I'm not going to say anything to Clay. He has enough to worry him now," she added, virtuously. Suddenly Rodney stooped and kissed her, almost savagely. "Then I'm going," he said. And to her great surprise he went. Alone in his room upstairs, Rodney had, in his anger, a glimpse of insight. He saw her life filled with small emotions, lacking the courage for big ones. He saw her, like a child, clutching one piece of cake and holding out a hand for another. He saw her, taking always, giving never. "She's not worth it," he muttered. On the way to the station he reflected bitterly over the past year. He did not blame her so much as he blamed himself. He had been playing a game, an attractive game. During the first months of it his interest in Natalie had been subordinate to his interest in her house. He had been creating a beautiful thing, and he had had a very real joy in it. But lately he knew that his work on the house had been that he might build a background for Natalie. He had put into it the best of his ability, and she was not worth it. For some days he neither wrote nor called her up. He was not happy, but he had a sense of relief. He held his head a trifle higher, was his own man again, and began to make tentative inquiries as to whether he could be useful in the national emergency or not. He was half-hearted at first, but he found out something. The mere fact that he wanted to work in some capacity brought back some of his old friends. They had seemed to drop away before, but they came back heartily and with hands out. "Work?" said Terry Mackenzie at the club one day, looking up from the billiard table, where he was knocking balls about, rather at haphazard. "Why, of course you can work. What about these new cantonments we're building all over the country? You ought to be useful there. They don't want 'em pretty, though." And Terry had laughed. But he put down his cue and took Rodney by the arm. "Let's ask Nolan about it," he said. "He's in the reading room, tearing the British strategy to pieces. He knows everything these days, from the draft law to the month's shipping losses. Come along." It was from Nolan, however, that Rodney first realized how seriously Clayton's friends were taking his affair with Natalie, and that not at first from anything he said. It was an indefinable aloofness of manner, a hostility of tone. Nolan never troubled himself to be agreeable unless it suited his inclination, and apparently Terry found nothing unusual in his attitude. But Rodney did. "Something he could build," said Nolan, repeating Terry's question. "How do I know? There's a lot of building going on, Page, but it's not exactly your sort." And there was a faint note of contempt in his voice. "Who would be the man to see in Washington?" Rodney inquired. "I'll look it up and let you know. You might call me up to morrow." Old Terry, having got them together, went back to his billiards and left them. Nolan sat down and picked up his paper with an air of ending the interview. But he put it down again as Rodney turned to leave the room. Page? Yes? Do you mind having a few minutes' talk? Rodney braced himself. Not at all. But Nolan was slow to begin. He sat, newspaper on his knees, his deep-set eyes thoughtful. When he began, it was slowly. "I am one of Clay Spencer's oldest friends," he said. "He's a white man, the whitest man I know. Naturally, anything that touches him touches me in a way." "Well?" "The name stands for a good bit, too. His father and his grandfather were the same sort. It's not often in this town that we have 3 generations without a breath of scandal against them." Rodney flushed angrily. "What has that got to do with me?" he demanded. "I don't know. I don't want to know. I simply wanted to tell you that there are a good many of us who take a peculiar pride in Clayton Spencer, and who resent anything that reflects on a name we respect rather highly." "That sounds like a threat." "Not at all. I was merely calling your attention to something I thought perhaps you had forgotten." Then he got up, and his tone changed, became brisk, almost friendly. "Now, about this building thing. If you're in earnest, I think it can be managed. You won't get any money to speak of, you know." "I don't want any money," sullenly. "Fine. You'll probably have to go West somewhere, and you'll be set down in the center of 100 cornfields and told to make them overnight into a temporary town. I suppose you've thought of all that." "I'll go wherever I'm sent." "Come along to the telephone, then." Rodney hesitated. He felt cheap and despicable, and his anger was still hot. They wanted to get him out of town. He saw that. They took little enough trouble to hide it. Well, he would go. He wanted to go anyhow, and he would show them something, too, if he got a chance. He would show them that he was as much a man as Clayton Spencer. He eyed Nolan's insolently slouching figure with furious eyes. But he followed him. Had he secured an immediate appointment, things might have been different for him. Like Chris Valentine, he had had one decent impulse, and like Chris, too, there was a woman behind it. But Chris had been able to act on his impulse at once, and Rodney was compelled to wait while the mills of the government ground slowly. Then, on the 14th of August, Natalie telegraphed him. "Have had bad news about Graham. Can you come?" He thought of Graham ill, possibly dead, and he took the next train late in the evening. It was midweek, and Natalie was alone. He had thought of that possibility in the train, and he was miserably uncomfortable, with all his joy at the prospect of seeing her again. He felt that the emergency must be his justification. Clayton was still abroad, and even his most captious critics would admit that Natalie should have a friend by if she were in trouble. Visions of Graham wounded filled his mind. He was anxious, restless, and in a state of the highest nervous tension. And there was no real emergency. He found Natalie in the drawing room, pacing the floor. She was still in her morning dress, and her eyes were red and swollen. She gave him both her hands, and he was surprised to find them cold as ice. "I knew you would come," she said. "I am so alone, so terrified." He could hardly articulate. "What is it?" "Graham has been ordered abroad." He stood still, staring at her, and then he dropped her hands. "Is that all?" he asked dully. "No." "Good heavens, Natalie, tell me. I've been frantic with anxiety about you." "He was married to night to Delight Haverford." And still he stared at her. "Then he's not hurt, or ill?" "I didn't say he was. Good gracious, Rodney, isn't that bad enough?" "But what did you expect? He would have to go abroad sometime. You knew that. I'm sorry, but why in God's name didn't you say in your wire what the trouble was?" "You sound exactly like Clay." She was entirely incapable of understanding. She stood before him, straight and resentful, and yet strangely wistful and appealing. "I send you word that my only son is going to France, that he is married without so much as consulting me, that he is going to war and may never come back. I needed you, and you said once that when I needed you, wherever you were, you would come. So I sent for you, and now you act like Clay." "Have you any one here?" "The servants! Good gracious, Rodney. Are you worrying about that?" "Only for you, Natalie." "We resent anything that reflects on a name we respect rather highly." That was what Nolan had said. "I'm sorry about Graham, dearest. I am sorry about any trouble that comes to you. You know that, Natalie. I'm only regretful that you have let me place you in an uncomfortable position. If my being here is known Look here, Natalie, dear. I hate to bother you, but I'll have to take one of the cars and go back to the city to night." "Aren't you being rather absurd?" He hesitated. He could not tell her of that awkward talk with Nolan. There were many things he could not tell her. His own desire to rehabilitate himself among the men he knew, his own new-born feeling that to take advantage of Clayton's absence on business connected with the war was peculiarly indefensible. "I shall order the car at once," she said, and touched a bell. When she turned he was just behind her, but although he held out his arms, she evaded them, her eyes hard and angry. "I wish you would try to understand," he said. "I do, very thoroughly. Too thoroughly. You are afraid for yourself, not for me. I am in trouble, but that is a secondary consideration. Don't bother about me, Rodney. I have borne a great deal alone in my life, and I can bear this." She turned and went with considerable dignity out of the door. "Natalie!" he called. But he heard her, with a gentle rustle of silks, going up the staircase. It did not add to his comfort that she had left him to order the car. All through the night Rodney rode and thought. He was angry at Natalie, but he was angrier at himself. He felt that he had been brutal, unnecessarily callous. After all, her only son was on his way to war. It was on the cards that he might not come back. And he had let his uneasiness dominate his sympathy. He had lost her, but then he had never had her. He never could have her. Halfway to town, on a back road, the car broke down, and after vainly endeavoring to start it, the chauffeur set off on foot to secure help. Rodney slept uncomfortably and wakened with the movement of the machine to find it broad day. That was awkward, for Natalie's car was conspicuous, marked, too, with her initials. He asked to be set down at a suburban railway station, and was dismayed to find it crowded with early commuters who stared at the big car with interest. On the platform, eyeing him with unfriendly eyes, was Nolan. Rodney made a movement toward him. The situation was intolerable, absurd. But Nolan turned his back and proceeded to read his newspaper. Perhaps not in years had Rodney Page faced the truth about himself so clearly as he did that morning, riding into the city on the train which carried, somewhat ahead, that quietly contemptuous figure that was Denis Nolan. Faced the truth, saw himself for what he was, and loathed the thing he saw. For a little time, too, it was given him to see Natalie for what she was, for what she would always be. Her sole contribution to life, the web of her selfishness, carefully woven, floating apparently aimlessly, and yet snaring and holding relentlessly whatever it touched. Killing freedom. He saw Clayton and Graham and himself, feeders for her monstrous complacency and vanity, and he made a definite determination to free himself. "I'm through," he reflected savagely. "I'll show them something, too. He hesitated. How lovely she was. And she cared for him. She was small and selfish and unspeakably vain, but she cared for him. The war had done something for Rodney Page. He no longer dreamed the old dream of turning her ice to fire. But he dreamed, for a moment, something finer. He saw Natalie his, and growing big and fine through love. He saw himself and Natalie, like cards in the game of life, redealt. A new combination, a winning hand. End of chapter 46. Chapter 47 of Dangerous Days. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Very quietly, Audrey had taken herself out of Clayton's life. She sent him a little note of farewell. "We have had 10 wonderful months, Clay," she wrote. "We ought to be very happy. So few have as much. And we both know that this can't go on. I am going abroad. I have an opportunity to go over and see what English women are doing in the way of standing behind their men at war. Then I am to tell our women at home. Not that they need it now, bless them. I believe you will be glad to know that I am to be on the same side of the ocean with Graham. I could get to him, I think, if anything should go wrong. Will you send him the enclosed address? But, my dear, the address is for him, not for you. You must not write to me. I have used up every particle of moral courage I possess as it is. And I am holding this in my mind, as you must. Time is a great healer of all wounds. We could have been happy together, oh, my dear, so very happy together. Now that I am going, let me be frank for once. I have given you the finest thing I am capable of. I am better for caring for you, as I do. But those days in the hospital told me we couldn't go on. Things like that don't stand still. Maybe we are only human, Clay. Maybe if the old days were still here we might have compromised with life. I don't know. But I do know that we never will, now. After all, we have had a great deal, and we still have. It is a wonderful thing to know that somewhere in the world is some person who loves you. To waken up in the morning to it, to go to sleep remembering it, and to have kept that love fine and clean is a wonderful thing, too. I am not always on a pinnacle. There have been plenty of times when the mere human want of you has sent me to the dust. Is it wrong to tell you that? But of course not. You know it. But you and I know this, Clay dear. Love that is hopeless, that cannot end in marriage, does one of two things. Either it degrades or it exalts. It leaves its mark always, but that mark does not need to be a stain. Clayton lived, for a time after that, in a world very empty and very full. The new plant was well under way. Not only was he about to make shells for the government at a nominal profit, but Washington was asking him to assume new and wide responsibilities. He accepted. He wanted so to fill the hours that there would be no time to remember. But more than that, he was actuated by a fine and glowing desire to serve. Perhaps underlying it all was the determination to be, in every way, the man Audrey thought him to be. And there was, too, a square-jawed resolution to put behind Graham, and other boys like Graham, all the shells and ammunition they needed. He worked hard, more than hard. Old Terry, meeting him one day in the winter that followed, was shocked at his haggard face. "Better take a little time off, Clay," he suggested. "We're going to Miami next week. How about 10 days or so? Fishing is good this year." "Can't very well take a holiday just now. Too much to do, Terry." Old Terry went home and told his wife. "Looks like the devil," he said. "He'll go down sick one of these days. I suppose it's no use telling Natalie." "None whatever," said Mrs. Terry. "And anyhow, it's a thing I shouldn't care to tell Natalie." "What do you mean, not care to tell Natalie?" "Hard work doesn't make a man forget how to smile." "Oh, come now. He's cheerful enough. If you mean because Graham's fighting?" "That's only part of it," said Mrs. Terry sagely, and relapsed into one of the poignant silences that drove old Terry to a perfect frenzy of curiosity. Then, in January of 1918, a crisis came to Clayton and Natalie Spencer. Graham was wounded. Clayton was at home when the news came. Natalie had been having one of her ill-assorted, meticulously elaborate dinner parties, and when the guests were gone they were for a moment alone in the drawing-room of their town-house. Clayton was fighting in himself the sense of irritation Natalie's dinners always left, especially the recent one. She was serving, he knew, too much food. In the midst of the agitation on conservation, her dinners ran their customary 7 courses. There was too much wine, too. But it occurred to him that only the wine had made the dinner endurable. Then he tried to force himself into better humor. Natalie was as she was, and if in an unhappy, struggling, dying world she found happiness in display, God knew there was little enough happiness. He was not at home very often. He could not spoil her almost childish content in the small things that made up her life. "I think it was very successful," she said, surveying herself in one of the corner mirrors. "Do you like my gown, Clay?" "It's very lovely." "It's new. I've been getting some clothes, Clay. You'll probably shriek at the bills. But all this talk about not buying clothes is nonsense, you know. The girls who work in the shops have to live." "Naturally. Of course there is other work open to them now." "In munition plants, I dare say. To be blown up." He winced. The thought of that night the year before, when the plant went, still turned him sick. "Don't buy too many things, my dear," he said gently. "You know how things are." "I know it's your fault that they are as they are," she persisted. "Oh, I know it was noble of you, and all that. The country's crazy about you. But still, I think it was silly. Every one else is making money out of things, and you a lot of thanks you'll get when the war's over." "I don't particularly want thanks." Then the doorbell rang in the back of the house, and Buckham answered it. He was conscious at once that Natalie stiffened, and that she was watchful and a trifle pale. Buckham brought in a telegram on a tray. "Give it to me, Buckham," Natalie said, in a strained voice, and held out her hand for it. When she saw it was for Clayton, however, she relaxed. As he tore it open, Clayton was thinking. Evidently Natalie had been afraid of his seeing some message for her. Was it possible that Natalie He opened it. After what seemed a long time, he looked up. Her eyes were on him. "Don't be alarmed, my dear," he said. "It is not very bad. But Graham has been slightly wounded." "Sit down," he said sharply, as he saw her sway. "You are lying to me," she said, in a dreadful voice. "He's dead." "He is not dead, Natalie." He tried to put her into a chair, but she resisted him fiercely. "Let me alone. I want to see that telegram." And, very reluctantly, at last he gave it to her. Graham was severely wounded. It was from a man in his own department at Washington, who had just seen the official list. The nature of his wounding had not been stated. Natalie looked up from the telegram with a face like a painted mask. "This is your doing," she said. "You wanted him to go. You sent him into this. He will die, and you will have murdered him." The thought came to him, in that hour of stress, that she was right. Pitifully, damnably right. He had not wanted Graham to go, but he had wanted him to want to go. A thousand thoughts flashed through his mind, of Delight sleeping somewhere quietly after her day's work at the camp, of Graham himself, of that morning after the explosion and his frank, pitiful confession. And again of Graham, suffering, perhaps dying, and with none of his own about him. And through it all was the feeling that he must try to bring Natalie to reason, that it was incredible that she should call him his own son's murderer. "We must not think of his dying," he said. "We must only think that he is going to live, and to come back to us, Natalie dear." She flung off the arm he put around her. "And that," he went on, feeling for words out of the dreadful confusion in his mind, "if the worst comes, that he has done a magnificent thing. There is no greater thing, Natalie." "That won't bring him back to us," she said, still in that frozen voice. And suddenly she burst into hard, terrible crying. All that night he sat outside her door, for she would not allow him to come in. He had had Washington on the telephone, but when at last he got the connection, it was to learn that no further details were known. Toward dawn there came the official telegram from the War Department, but it told nothing more. Natalie was hysterical. He had sent for a doctor, and with Madeleine in attendance, the medical man had worked over her for hours. Going out toward morning, he had found Clayton in the hall and had looked at him sharply. "Better go to bed, Mr. Spencer," he advised. "It may not be as bad as you think, and they're doing fine surgery over there." And, as Clayton shook his head, "Mrs. Spencer will come round all right. She's hysterical, naturally. She'll be sending for you before long." With the dawn Clayton's thoughts cleared. If he and Natalie were ever to get together at all, it should be now, with this common grief between them. Perhaps, after all, it was not too late to rebuild his house of life. He had failed. Perhaps they had both failed, but the real responsibility was his. Inside the room he could hear her moaning, a low, monotonous, heartbreaking moan. He was terribly sorry for her. She had no exaltation to help her, no strength of soul, no strength of any sort. And, as men will under stress, he tried to make a bargain with his God. "Let him live," he prayed. "Bring him back to us and I will try again. I'll do better. I've been a rotten failure as far as she is concerned. But I'll try." He felt somewhat better after that, although he felt a certain ignominy, too, that always, until such a time, he had gone on his own, as it were, and that now, when he no longer sufficed for himself, he should beseech the Almighty. Natalie had had a sleeping powder, and at last he heard her moaning cease and the stealthy movements of her maid as she lowered the window shades. It was dawn. During the next 2 days Clayton worked as he had never worked before, still perhaps with that unspoken pact in mind. Worked, too, to forget. He had sent several cables, but no reply came until the 3rd day. He did not sleep at night. He did not even go to bed. He sat in the low chair in his dressing room, dozing occasionally, to waken with a start at some sound in the hall. Now and again, as the trained nurse who was watching Natalie at night moved about in the hallways, he would sit up, expecting a summons that did not come. She still refused to see him. It depressed and frightened him, for how could he fulfill his part of the compact when she so sullenly shut him out of her life? He was singularly simple in his fundamental beliefs. There was a great power somewhere, call it what one might, and it dealt out justice and mercy as one deserved it. On that, of course, had been built an elaborate edifice of creed and dogma, but curiously enough it all fell away now. He was, in those night hours, again the boy who had prayed for fair weather for circus day, and had promised in return to read his Bible through during the next year, and had done it. In the daytime, however, he was a man suffering terribly, and facing the complexities of his life alone. One thing he knew. This was decisive. Either, under the stress of a common trouble, he and Natalie would come together to make the best they could of the years to come, or they would be hopelessly alienated. But that was secondary to Graham. Everything was secondary to Graham, indeed. He had cabled Audrey, and he drew a long breath when on the 3rd day a cable came from her. She had located Graham at last. He had been shot in the chest, and there were pneumonia symptoms. "Shall stay with him," she ended, "and shall send daily reports." Next to his God he put his faith in Audrey. Almost he prayed to her. Dunbar, now a captain in the Military Intelligence Bureau, visiting him in his office one day, found Clayton's face an interesting study. Old lines of repression, new ones of anxiety marked him deeply. The boy, of course, he thought, and then reflected that it takes time to carve such lines as were written in the face of the man across the desk from him. Time and a woman, he considered shrewdly. His mind harked back to that dinner in the Spencer house, when diplomatic relations had been broken off with Germany and war seemed imminent. It was the wife, probably. He remembered that she had been opposed to war and to the boys going. There were such women in the country. There were fewer of them all the time, but they existed, women who saw in war only sacrifice. Women who counted no cost too high for peace. If they only hurt themselves, it did not matter, but they could and did do incredible damage. Clayton was going through some papers he had brought, and Dunbar had time to consider what to him was an interesting problem. Mrs. Spencer had kept the boy from immediate enlistment. He had wanted to go. Dunbar knew that. If she had allowed him to go, the affair with Anna Klein would have been ended. He knew all that story now. Then, if there had been no affair, Herman would not have blown up the munition works, and a good many lives, valuable to themselves at least, might have been saved. Curious, he reflected. One woman, and she probably sleeps well at nights and goes to church on Sundays." Clayton passed back his papers and ran a hand over his heavy hair. "They seem to be all right," he said. Dunbar rose. "Hope the next news will be better, Mr. Spencer." "I hope so." "I haven't told you, I think, that we have traced Rudolph Klein." Clayton's face set. "He's got away, unfortunately. Over the border into Mexico. They have a regular system there, the Germans. An underground railway to Mexico City. They have a paymaster on our side of the line. They even bank in one of our banks. Oh, we'll get them yet, of course, but they're damnably clever." "I suppose there is no hope of getting Rudolph Klein." "Not while the Germans are running Mexico," Captain Dunbar replied dryly. "He's living in a Mexican town just over the border. We're watching him. If he puts a foot on this side, we'll grab him." Clayton sat back after he had gone. He was in his old office at the mill, where Joey had once formed his unofficial partnership with the firm. Outside in the mill yard there was greater activity than ever, but many of the faces were new. The engineer who had once run the yard engine was building bridges in France. Hutchinson had heard the call and was learning to fly in Florida. The service flag over his office door showed hundreds of stars, and more were being added constantly. Joey dead, Graham wounded, his family life on the verge of disruption, and Audrey. Then, out of the chaos, there came an exaltation. He had given himself, his son, the wealth he had hoped to have, but thank God, he had had something to give. There were men who could give nothing, like old Terry Mackenzie, knocking billiard balls around at the club, and profanely wistful that he had had no son to go. His mind ranged over those pathetic, prosperous, sonless men who filed into the club late in the afternoons, and over the last editions and whiskey and sodas fought their futile warfare, their battleground a newspaper map, their upraised voices their only weapons. On parade days, when the long lines of boys in khaki went by, they were silent, heavy, inutile. They were too old to fight. The biggest thing in their lives was passing them by, as passed the lines of marching boys, and they had no part in it. They were feeding their hungry spirits on the dregs of war, on committee meetings and public gatherings, and they were being useful. But the great exaltation of offering their best was not for them. He was living a tragedy, but a greater tragedy was that of the childless. And back of that again was the woman who had not wanted children. There were many men today who were feeling the selfishness of a woman at home, men who had lost, somehow, their pride, their feeling of being a part of great things, men who went home at night to comfortable dwellings, with no vacant chair at the table, and dined in a peace they had not earned. Natalie had at least given him a son. He took that thought home with him in the evening. He stopped at a florist's and bought a great box of flowers for her, and sent them into her room with a little note. "Won't you let me come in and try to comfort you?" But Madeleine brought the box out again, and there was pity in her eyes. "Mrs. Spencer cannot have them in the room, sir. She says the odor of the flowers makes her ill." He knew Madeleine had invented the excuse, that Natalie had simply rejected his offering. He went downstairs and made a pretense of dining alone in the great room. It was there that Audrey's daily cable found him. Buckham brought it in shaking fingers, and stood by, white and still, while he opened it. Clayton stood up. He was very white, but his voice was full and strong. "He is better, Buckham, better." Suddenly Buckham was crying. His austere face was distorted, his lean body trembling. Clayton put his arm around the bowed old shoulders. And in that moment, as they stood there, master and man, Clayton Spencer had a flash of revelation. There was love and love. The love of a man for a woman, and of a woman for a man, of a mother for the child at her knee, of that child for its mother. But that the great actuating motive of a man's maturity, of the middle span, was vested along with his dreams, his pride and his love, in his son, his man child. Buckham, carrying his coffee into the library somewhat later, found him with his head down on his desk and the cablegram clutched in his outstretched hands. He tiptoed out very quietly. End of chapter 47. Chapter 48 of Dangerous Days by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Clayton's first impulse was to take the cable to Natalie, to brush aside the absurd defenses she had erected and behind which she cowered, terrified but obstinate, to say to her, "He is living, he is going to live, but this war is not over yet. If we want him to come through, we must stand together. We must deserve to have him come back to us." But by the time he reached the top of the stairs he knew he could not do it. She would not understand. She would think he was using Graham to further a reconciliation, and after her first joy was over he knew that he would see again that cynical smile that always implied that he was dramatizing himself. Nothing could dim his strong inner joy, but something of its outer glow faded. He would go to her later, not now. Nothing must spoil this great thankfulness of his. He gave Madeleine the cable and went down again to the library. After a time he began to go over the events of the past 18 months. His return from the continent, and that curious sense of unrest that had followed it, the opening of his eyes to the futility of his life. His failure to Natalie and her failure to him. Graham, made a man by war and by the love of a good woman. Chris, ending his sordid life in a blaze of glory, and forever forgiven his tawdry sins because of his one big hour. War took, but it gave also. It had taken Joey, for instance, but Joey had had his great moment. It was better to have one great moment and die than to drag on through useless years. And it was the same with a nation. A nation needed its hour. It was only in a crisis that it could know its own strength. How many of them who had been at that dinner of Natalie's months before had met their crisis bravely? Nolan was in France now. Doctor Haverford was at the front. Audrey was nursing Graham. Marion Hayden was in a hospital training school. Rodney Page was still building wooden barracks in a cantonment in Indiana and making good. He himself? They could never go back, none of them, to the old smug, complacent, luxurious days. They could no more go back than Joey could return to life again. War was the irrevocable step, as final as death itself. And he remembered something Nolan had said just before he sailed. "We have had one advantage, Clay. Or maybe it is not an advantage after all. Do you realize that you and I have lived through the golden age? We have seen it come and seen it go. The greatest height of civilization since the world began, the greatest achievements, the most opulent living. And we saw it all crash. It will be 1,000 years before the world will be ready for another." And later, "I suppose every life has its golden age. Generally we think it is youth. I'm not so sure. Youth is looking ahead. It has its hopes and its disappointments. The golden age in a man's life ought to be the age of fulfillment. It's nearer the 40s than the 20s. "Have you reached it?" "I'm going to, on the other side." And Clayton had smiled. "You are going to reach it," he said. "We are always going to find it, Nolan. It is always just ahead." And Nolan had given him one of his quick, understanding glances. There could be no golden age for him. For the golden age for a man meant fulfillment. The time came to every man when he must sit at the west window of his house of life and look toward the sunset. If he faced that sunset alone. He heard Madeleine carrying Natalie's dinner tray, and when she left the pantry she came to the door of the library. "Mrs. Spencer would like to see you, sir." "Thank you, Madeleine. I'll go up very soon." Suddenly he knew that he did not want to go up to Natalie's scented room. She had shut him out when she was in trouble. She had not cared that he, too, was in distress. She had done her best to invalidate that compact he had made. She had always invalidated him. To go back to the old way, to the tribute she enforced to feed her inordinate vanity, to the old hypocrisy of their relationship, to live again with the old lie, was impossible. He got up. He would not try to buy himself happiness at the cost of turning her adrift. But he must, some way, buy his self-respect. He heard her then on the staircase, that soft rustle which, it seemed to him, had rasped the silk of his nerves all their years together, with its insistence on her dainty helplessness, her femininity, her right to protection. The tap of her high heels came closer. He drew a long breath and turned, determinedly smiling, to face the door. Almost at once he saw that she was frightened. She had taken pains to look her best, but then she always did that. She was rouged to the eyes, and the floating white chiffon of her negligee gave to her slim body the illusion of youth, that last illusion to which she so desperately clung. But she was frightened. She stood in the doorway, one hand holding aside the heavy velvet curtain, and looked at him with wide, penciled eyes. "Clay?" "Yes, come in. Shall I have Buckham light a fire?" She came in slowly. "Do you suppose that cable is reliable?" "I should think so." "He may have a relapse." "We mustn't worry about what may come. He is better now. The chances are that he'll stay better." "Probably. I suppose because I have been so ill." He felt the demand for sympathy, but he had none to give. And he felt something else. Natalie was floundering, an odd word for her, always so sure of herself. She was frightened, unsure of herself, and floundering. Why? "Are you going to be in to night?" "Yes." She gave a curious little gesture. Then she evidently made up her mind, and she faced him defiantly. "Of course, if I had known he was going to be better, Clay, I wired yesterday for Rodney Page. He arrives to night." "Rodney?" "Yes." "I don't think I quite understand, Natalie. Why did you wire for him?" "You wouldn't understand, of course. I was in trouble. He has been my best friend. I tried to bear it alone, but I couldn't. "Alone? You wouldn't see me." "I couldn't, Clay." "Why?" "Because if Graham had died." Her mouth trembled. She put her hand to her throat. "You would have blamed me for his death?" "Yes." "Then even now if yes." The sheer cruelty of it sent him pale. Yet it was not so much deliberate as unconscious. She was forcing herself to an unwonted honesty. It was her honest conviction that he was responsible for Graham's wounding and danger. "Let me get to the bottom of this," he said quietly. "You hold me responsible. Very well. How far does that take us? How far does that take you? To Rodney?" "You needn't be brutal. Rodney understands me. He cares for me, Clay." "I see. And since you sent for him, I take it you care for Rodney." "I don't know. Isn't it time you do know? For God's sake, Natalie, make up your mind to some course and stick to it." But accustomed as he was to the curious turns of her mind, he was still astounded to have her turn on him and accuse him of trying to get rid of her. It was not until later that he realized in that attitude of hers her old instinct of shifting the responsibility from her own shoulders. And then Rodney was announced. The unreality of the situation persisted. Rodney's strained face and uneasy manner, his uniform, the blank pause when he learned that Graham was better, and when the ordinary banalities of greeting were over. Beside Clayton he looked small, dapper, and wretchedly uncomfortable, and yet even Clayton had to acknowledge a sort of dignity in the man. He felt sorry for him, for the disillusion that was to come. And at the same time he felt an angry contempt for him, that he should have forced so theatrical a situation. That the night which saw Graham's beginning recovery should be tarnished by the wild clutch after happiness of two people who had done so little to earn it. He saw another totally different scene for a moment. He saw Graham in his narrow bed that night in some dimly lighted hospital ward, and he saw Audrey beside him, watching and waiting and praying. A wild desire to be over there, one of that little group, almost overcame him. And instead, "Natalie has not been well, Rodney," he said. "I rather think if you have anything to say to me, we would better talk alone." Natalie went out, her draperies trailing behind her. Clayton listened as she moved slowly up the stairs. For the last time he heard that soft rustling which had been the accompaniment to so many of the most poignant hours of his life. He listened until it had died away. End of chapter 48. Chapter 49 of Dangerous Days by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. For months, Rudolph Klein had been living in a little Mexican town on the border. There were really two towns, but they were built together with only a strip of 100 feet between. Along this strip ran the border itself, with a tent pitched on the American side and patrols of soldiers guarding it. The American side was bright and clean, orderly and self-respecting, but only 100 feet away, unkempt, dusty, with adobe buildings and a notorious gambling hell in plain view, was Mexico itself, leisurely, improvident, not over-scrupulous Mexico. At first Rudolph was fairly contented. It amused him. He liked the idleness of it. He liked kicking the innumerable Mexican dogs out of his way. He liked baiting the croupiers in the Owl. He liked wandering into that notorious resort and shoving Hindus, Chinamen, and Mexicans out of the way while he flung down a silver dollar and watched the dealers with cunning, avaricious eyes. He liked his own situation, too. It amused him to think that here he was safe, while only 100 feet away he was a criminal, fugitive from the law. He liked to go to the very border itself and jeer at the men on guard there. "If I was on that side," he would say, "you'd have me in one of those rotten uniforms, wouldn't you? Come on over, fellows. The liquor's fine." Then, one day, a Chinaman he had insulted gave him an unexpected shove, and he had managed to save himself by a foot from the clutch of a quiet-faced man in plain clothes who spent a certain amount of time lounging on the other side of the border. That had sobered him. He kept away from the border itself after that, although the temptation of it drew him. After a few weeks, when the novelty had worn off, he began to hunger for the clean little American town across the line. He wanted to talk to someone. He wanted to boast, to be candid. These Mexicans only laughed when he bragged to them. But he dared not cross. There was a high fenced enclosure behind the Owl, the segregated district of the town. There, in tiny one-roomed houses, built in rows like barracks, were the girls and women who had drifted to this jumping-off place of the world. In the daytime they slept or sat on the narrow ramshackle porches, untidy, noisy, unspeakably wretched. At night, however, they blossomed forth in tawdry finery, in the dancing space behind the gambling tables. Some of them were fixtures. They had drifted there, from New Orleans, perhaps, or Southern California, and they lacked the initiative or the money to get away. But most of them came in, stayed a month or two, found the place a nightmare with its shootings and stabbings, and then disappeared. At first Rudolph was popular in this hell of the underworld. He spent money easily, he danced well, he had audacity and a sort of sardonic humor. They asked no questions, those poor wretches who had themselves slid over the edge of life. They took what came, grateful for little pleasures, glad even to talk their own tongue. And then, one broiling August day, late in the afternoon, when the compound was usually seething with the first fetid life of the day, Rudolph found it suddenly silent when he entered it, and hostile, contemptuous eyes on him. A girl with Anna Klein's eyes, a girl he had begun to fancy, suddenly said, "Draft dodger." There was a ripple of laughter around the compound. They commenced to bait him, those women he would not have wiped his feet on at home. They literally laughed him out of the compound. He went home to his stifling, windowless adobe room, with its sagging narrow bed, its candle, its broken crockery, and he stood in the center of the room and chewed his nails with fury. After a time he sat down and considered what to do next. He would have to move on some time. As well now as ever. He was sick of the place. He began preparations to move on, gathering up the accumulation of months of careless living for destruction. He picked some newspapers, preparatory to throwing them away, and a name caught his attention. Standing there, inside his doorway in the Mexican dusk, he read of Graham's recent wounding, his mending, and the fact that he had won the Croix de Guerre. Supreme bitterness was Rudolph's then. Stage stuff, he muttered. But in the depths of his warped soul there was bitter envy. He knew well with what frightened yet adoring eyes Anna Klein had devoured that news of Graham Spencer. While for him there was the girl in the compound back of the Owl, with Anna Klein's eyes, filled when she looked at him with that bitterest scorn of all, the contempt of the wholly contemptible. That night he went to the Owl. He had shaved and had his hair cut, and he wore his only remaining decent suit of clothes. He passed through the swinging gate in the railing which separated the dancing floor from the tables, and went up to the line of girls, sitting in that saddest waiting of all the world, along the wall. There was an ominous silence at his approach. He planted himself in front of the girl with eyes like Anna Klein. "Are you going to dance?" "Not with you," she replied evenly. And again the ripple of laughter spread. "Why not?" "Because you're a coward," she said. "I'd rather dance with a Chinaman." "If you think I'm here because I'm afraid to fight, you can think again. Not that I care what you think." He had meant to boast a little, to intimate that he had pulled off a big thing, but he saw that he was ridiculous. The situation infuriated him. Suddenly he burst into foul-mouthed invective, until one of the girls said, wearily, "Oh, cut that out, you slacker." And he knew that no single word he had used against them, out of a vocabulary both extensive and horrible, was to them so degraded as that single one applied to him. Late that night he received a tip from a dealer at one of the 21 tables. There were inquiries being made for him across the border. That very evening the dealer had gone across for a sack of flour, and he had heard about it. "You'd better get out," said the dealer. "I'm as safe here as I'd be in Mexico City." "Don't be too sure, son. You're not any too popular here. There's such a thing as being held up and carried over the border. It's been done before now." "I'm sick of this hole, anyhow," Rudolph muttered, and moved away in the crowd. The mechanical piano was banging in the dance hall as he slipped out into the darkness, under the clear starlight of the Mexican night, and the gate of the compound stood open. He passed it with an oath. Long before he had provided for such a contingency. By the same agency which had got him to the border, he could now be sent further on. At something after midnight, clad in old clothes and carrying on his back a rough outfit of a blanket and his remaining wardrobe, he knocked at the door of a small adobe house on the border of the town. An elderly German with a candle admitted him. "Well, I'm off," Rudolph said roughly. "And time enough, too," said the German gruffly. Rudolph was sullenly silent. He was in this man's power, and he knew it. But the German was ready enough to do his part. For months he had been doing this very thing, starting through the desert toward the south slackers and fugitives of all descriptions. He gathered together the equipment, a map with water holes marked, a canteen covered with a dirty plaid cloth casing, a small supply of condensed foods, in tins mostly, and a letter to certain Germans in Mexico City who would receive hospitably any American fugitives and ask no questions. "How about money?" Rudolph inquired. The German shrugged his shoulders. "You will not need money in the desert," he said. "And you have spent much money here on the women. You should have safed it." "I was told you would give me money." But the German shook his head. "You will find money in Mexico City if you get there," he said cryptically. And Rudolph found neither threats nor entreaties of any avail. He started out of the town, turning toward the south and the west. Before him there stretched days of lonely traveling, through the sand and cactus of the desert, of blistering sun and cold nights, of anxious searches for water-holes. It was because of the water-holes that he headed southwest, for such as they were lay in tiny hidden oases in the canyons. Almost as soon as he left the town he was in the desert. A detached ranch, a suggestion of a road, a fenced-in cotton field or two, an irrigation ditch, and then sand. He was soft from months of inaction, from the cactus whiskey of Mexico, too, that ate into a man like a corrosive acid. But he went on steadily, putting behind him as rapidly as possible the border, and the girls who had laughed at him. He traveled by a pointed mountain which cut off the stars at the horizon, and as the miles behind him increased, in spite of his growing fatigue, his spirits rose. Before him lay the fullness of life again. Mexico City was a stake worth gambling for. He was gambling, he knew. He had put up his life, and his opponent was thirst. He knew that well enough, too, and the figure rather amused him. "Playing against that, all right," he muttered. He paused and turned around. The sun had lifted over the rim of the desert, a red disk which turned the gleaming white alkali patches to rose. "By God," he said, "that's the ante, is it? A red chip." A caravan of mules was coming up from the head of the Gulf of California. It moved in a cloud of alkali dust and sand, its ore sacks coated white. The animals straggled along, wandering out of the line incessantly, and thrust back into place by muleteers who cracked long whips and addressed them vilely. At a place where a small rock placed on another marked a side trail to water, the caravan turned and moved toward the mountains. Close as they appeared, the outfit was 3 hours getting to the foothills. There was a low meadow now, covered with pale green grass. Quail scurried away under the mesquite bushes, stealthily whistling, and here and there the 2 stones still marked the way. With the instinct of desert creatures, the mules hurried their pace. Pack saddles creaked, spurs jingled. Life, insistent, thirsty life, quickened the dead plain. A man rode ahead. He dug his spurs into his horse and cantered, elbows flapping, broad-brimmed hat drawn over his eyes. For hours he had been fighting the demon of thirst. His tongue was dry, his lips cracking. The trail continued to be marked with its double stones, but it did not enter the cool canyon ahead. It turned and skirted the base of the bare mountain slope. The man's eyes sharpened. He knew very definitely what he was looking for, and at last he saw it, a circle of flat stones some 20 feet across, the desert sign for a buried spring. But there was something inside the circle, something which lay still. The man put his horse to the gallop again. There was a canteen lying in the trail, a canteen covered with a dirty plaid casing. The horse's hoof struck it, and it gave out a dry, metallic sound. "Poor devil," muttered the rider. He dismounted and turned the figure over. "God!" he said, "and water under him all the time." Then he dragged the quiet figure outside the ring of stones, and getting a spade from his saddle, fell to digging in the center. A foot below the surface, water began to appear, clear, cold water. He lay down flat and drank out of the pool. Clayton Spencer was alone in his house. In the months since Natalie had gone he had not been there a great deal. He had been working very hard. He had not been able to shoulder arms, but he had, nevertheless, fought a good fight. He was very tired. During the day a sort of fierce energy upheld him. Because in certain things he had failed, he was the more determined to succeed in others. Not for himself. Ambition of that sort had died of the higher desire to serve his country. But because the sense of failure in his private life haunted him. The house was very quiet. Buckham came in to mend the fire, issuing from the shadows like a lean old ghost, and eyeing him with tender, faded old eyes. "Is there anything else, sir?" "Thanks, no, Buckham." "Yes, Mr. Spencer." "I have not spoken about it, but I think you have understood. Mrs. Spencer is not coming back." "Yes, Mr. Spencer." I had meant to close the house, but certain things. Captain Spencer's wife expects a child. I would rather like to have her come here for the birth. After that, if the war is over, I shall turn the house over to them. You would stay on, I hope, Buckham." "I'll stay, sir. His face worked nervously. "I feel toward the captain as I would to my own son, sir. I have already thought that, perhaps, the old nursery has been cleaned and aired for weeks, Mr. Spencer." Clayton felt a thrill of understanding for the old man through all the years he had watched and served them. He had reflected their joys and their sorrows. He had suffered the family destiny without having shaped it. He had lived vicariously their good hours and their bad. And now, in his old age, he was waiting again for the vicarious joy of Graham's child. "But you'll not be leaving the house, sir?" "I don't know. I shall keep my rooms, but I shall probably live at the club. The young people ought to be alone for a while. There are readjustments. You never married, Buckham?" "No, Mr. Spencer. I intended to at one time. I came to this country to make a home, and as I was rather a long time about it, she married some one else." Clayton caught the echo of an old pain in Buckham's repressed voice. Buckham, too. Was there, in the life of every man, some woman tragedy? Buckham, sitting alone in his west window and looking toward the sunset, Buckham had his memories. "She lost her only son at Neuve Chapelle," Buckham was saying quietly. "In a way it was as though I had lost a boy. She never cared for the man she married. He was a fine boy, sir. You may remember the night I was taken ill in the pantry?" "Is her husband still living?" "No, Mr. Spencer." "Do you ever think of going back and finding her?" "I have, sir, but I don't know. I like to remember her as she used to be. I have some beautiful memories. And I think sometimes it is better to live on memories. They are more real than reality, sir." Long after Buckham had withdrawn, Clayton paced the floor of the library. Was Buckham right? Was the real life of a man his mental life? Was any love so great as a man's dream of love? Peace was on the way. Soon this nightmare of war would be over, and in the great awakening love would again take the place of hate. Love of man for man, of nation for nation. Peace and the things of peace. Time to live, time to hope with the death cloud gone. Time to work and time to play. Time to love a woman and cherish her for the rest of life, if only. His failure with Natalie had lost him something. She had cost him his belief in himself. Her last words had crystallized his own sense of failure. "I admit all your good qualities, Clay. Heaven knows they are evident enough. But you are the sort people admire. They don't love you. They never will." Yet that night he had had a curious sense that old Buckham loved him. Maybe he was the sort men loved and women admired. He sat down and leaned back in his chair, watching the fire logs. He felt very tired. What was it that Buckham had said about memories? But Buckham was old. He was young and strong. There would be many years, and even his most poignant memories would grow dim. Audrey, Audrey. From the wall over the mantel, Natalie's portrait still surveyed the room with its delicate complacence. He looked up at it. Yes, Natalie had been right. He was not the sort to make a woman happy. There were plenty of men, young men, men still plastic, men who had not known shipwreck, and some such man Audrey would marry. Perhaps already in France. He got up. His desk was covered with papers, neatly endorsed by his secretary. He turned out all the lights but his desk lamp. Natalie's gleaming flesh tones died into the shadows, and he stood for a moment looking up at it, a dead thing, remote, flat, without significance. Then he sat down at his desk and took up a bundle of government papers. There was still work. Thank God for work. End of chapter 49. Chapter 50 of Dangerous Days by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Audrey was in Paris on the 11th of November. Now and then she got back there and revelled for a day or two in the mere joy of paved streets and great orderly buildings. She liked the streets and the crowds. She liked watching the American boys swaggering along, smoking innumerable cigarettes and surveying the city with interested, patronizing eyes. And always, walking briskly along the Rue Royale or the Avenue de l'Opéra, or in the garden of the Tuileries where the schoolboys played their odd French games, her eyes were searching the faces of the men she met. Any tall man in civilian clothes set her heart beating faster. She was quite honest with herself. She knew that she was watching for Clay, and she had a magnificent shamelessness in her quest. And now at last the Daily Mail had announced his arrival in France, and at first every ring of her telephone had sent her to it, somewhat breathless but quite confident. He would, she considered, call up the Red Cross at the Hotel Regina, and they would, by her instructions, give her hotel. Then, on that Monday morning, which was the 11th, she realized that he would not call her up. She knew it suddenly and absolutely. She sat down, when the knowledge came to her, with a sickening feeling that if he did not come to her now, he never would come. Yet even then she did not doubt that he cared. Cared as desperately as she did. The bond still held. She tried very hard, sitting there by her wood fire in the orderly uniform which made her so quaintly young and boyish, to understand the twisted mental processes that kept him away from her now that he was free. And in the end she came rather close to the truth. His sense of failure, his loss of confidence in himself where his love life was concerned, the strange twisting and warping that were Natalie's sole legacy from their years together. For months she had been tending broken bodies and broken spirits. But the broken pride of a man was a strange and terrible thing. She did not know where he was stopping, and in the congestion of the Paris hotels it would be practically impossible to trace him. And there, too, her own pride stepped in. He must come to her. He knew she cared. She had been honest with him always, with a sort of terrible honesty. Surveying the past months, she wondered, not for the first time, what had held them apart so long, against the urge that had become the strongest thing in life to them both. The strength in her had come from him. She knew that. But where had Clay got his strength? Men were not like that often. Failing final happiness, they so often took what they could get, like Chris. Perhaps for the first and last time, she saw Clayton Spencer that morning with her mind as well as with her heart. She saw him big and generous and fine, but she saw him also not quite so big as his love, conventional, bound by tradition and early training, somewhat rigid, Calvinistic, and dominated still by a fierce sex pride. At once the weakness of the middle span and its safety. And, woman fashion, she loved him for both his weakness and his strength. A bigger man might have taken her. A smaller man would have let her go. Clay was just Clay, single-hearted, intelligent but not shrewd, blundering, honest Clay. She was one great ache for the shelter of his arms. She had a small sense of shame that on that day of all others she should be obsessed with her own affairs. This was a great day. That morning, if all went well, the war was to cease. The curtain was to fall on the great melodrama, and those who had watched it and those who had played in it would, with the drop of the curtain, turn away from the illusion that is war to the small and quiet things of home. Home, she repeated. She had no home. But it was a great day nevertheless. Only that morning the white-capped femme de chambre had said with exaltation in her great eyes, "So it is finished, madame, or soon will be, in an hour or two." "It will be finished, Suzanne." "And madame will go back to the life she lived before." Her eyes had turned to where, on the dressing table, lay the gold fittings of Audrey's dressing case. She visualized Audrey back in rich, opulent America, surrounded by the luxury the gold trinkets would indicate. "Madame must be lovely in the costume for a ball," she said, and sighed. For her, a farm in Brittany, the endless round of small duties. For the American. Sitting there alone, Audrey felt already the reactions of peace. The war had torn up such roots as had held her. She was terribly aware, too, that she had outgrown her old environment. The old days were gone. The old Audrey was gone. And in her place was a quiet woman whose hands had known service and would never again be content to be idle. Yet she knew that, with the war, the world call would be gone. Not again for her, detached, impersonal service. She was not of the great of the earth. What she wanted, quite simply, was the service of love. To have her own and to care for them. She hoped very earnestly that she would be able to look beyond her own four walls, to see distress and to help it. But she knew, as she knew herself, that the real call to her would always be love. She felt a certain impatience at herself. This was to be the greatest day in the history of the world. And while all the earth waited for the signal guns, she waited for a man who had apparently determined not to take her back into his life. She went out onto her small stone balcony on the Rue d'Aunou, which looked out to where, on the Rue de la Paix, the city traffic moved with a sort of sporadic expectancy. Men stopped and consulted their watches. A few stood along the curb and talked in low voices. Groups of men in khaki walked by, or stopped to glance into the shop windows. They, too, were waiting. She could see, far below, her valet de chambre in his green felt apron, and the concierge in his blue frock coat and brass buttons, unbending in the new democracy of hope to talk to a cabman. Suddenly Audrey felt the same exaltation that had been in Suzanne's eyes. Those boys below in uniform, they were not tragic now. They were the hope of the world, not its sacrifice. They were going to live. They were going to live. She went into her bedroom and put on her service hat. And as she opened the door, Suzanne was standing outside, one hand upraised. Into the quiet hallway there came the distant sound of the signal guns. "C'est l'armistice!" cried Suzanne, and suddenly broke into wild, hysterical sobbing. All the way downstairs Audrey was praying, not articulately, but in her heart, that this was indeed the end, that the grapes of wrath had all been trampled, that the nations of the world might again look forward instead of back. And, because she was not of the great of the earth, but only a loving woman, that somewhere Clay was hearing the guns, as she was, and would find hope in them, and a future. When a great burden is lifted, the relief is not always felt at once. The galled places still ache. The sense of weight persists. And so with Paris. Not at once did the city rejoice openly. It prayed first, and then it counted the sore spots, and they were many. And it was days, too. There had been no time to discount peace in advance. The streets filled at once, but at first it was with a chastened people. Audrey herself felt numb and unreal. She moved mechanically with the shifting crowd, looking overhead as a captured German plane flew by, trying to comprehend the incomprehensible. But by midday the sober note of the crowds had risen to a higher pitch. A file of American doughboys, led by a corporal, with a tin trumpet and officered by a sergeant with an enormous American cigar, goose-stepped down the Avenue de l'Opéra, gaining recruits at every step. It snake-danced madly through the crowd, singing that one lyric standby of Young America, "Hail, hail, the gang's all here." But the gang was not all there, and they knew it. Some of them lay in the Argonne or at Chateau Thierry, and for them peace had come too late. But the Americans, like the rest of the world, had put the past behind them. Here was the present, the glorious present, and Paris on a sunny Monday. And after that there would be home. "Hail, hail, the gang's all here. What the hell do we care? What the hell do we care? Hail, hail, the gang's all here. What the hell do we care now?" Gradually the noise became uproarious. There were no bands in Paris, and any schoolboy with a tin horn or a toy drum could start a procession. Bearded little poilus, arm in arm from curb to curb, marched grinning down the center of the streets, capturing and kissing pretty midinettes or surrounding officers and dancing madly. Audrey saw an Algerian, ragged and dirty from the battlefields, kiss on both cheeks a portly British admiral of the fleet, and was herself kissed by a French sailor with extreme robustness and a slight tinge of vin ordinaire. She went on smiling. If only Clay were seeing all this! He had worked so hard, he had a right to this wonderful hour at least. If he had gone to the front, to see Graham, but then it must be rather wonderful at the front too. She tried to visualize it, the guns quiet, and the strained look gone from the faces of the men, with the wonderful feeling that as there was to day, now there would also be to morrow. She felt a curious shrinking from the people she knew. For this one day she wanted to be alone. This peace was a thing of the soul, and of the soul alone. She knew what it would be with the people she knew best in Paris. Hastily arranged riotous parties, a great deal of champagne and noise, and overlying the real sentiment, much sentimentality. She realized with a faint smile that the old Audrey would have welcomed that very gaiety. She was even rather resentful with herself for her own aloofness. She quite forgot luncheon, and early afternoon found her on the balcony of the Crillon Hotel, looking at the Place de la Concorde. Paris was truly awake by that time, and going mad. The long quiet fountains were playing. Poilus and American soldiers had seized captured German cannon and were hauling them wildly about. If in the morning the crowd had been largely khaki, now the French blue predominated. Flags and confetti were everywhere, and every motor, as it pushed slowly through the crowd, carried on roof and running board and engine hood crowds of self-invited passengers. A British band was playing near the fountain. A line of helmets above the mass and wild cheers revealed French cavalry riding through, and, heralded by jeeps and much applause, came a procession of the proletariat, of odds and ends, soldiers and shop girls, mechanics and street sweepers, and cabmen and students, carrying an effigy of the Kaiser on a gibbet. As the sun went down, the outlines of the rejoicing city took on the faint mist blue of a dream city. It softened the outlines of the Eiffel Tower to strange and fairy-like beauty, and it gave to the trees in the Tuileries gardens the lack of definition of an old engraving. And as if to remind the rejoicing of the price of their happiness, there came limping through the crowd a procession of the mutilés. They stumped along on wooden legs or on crutches. They rode in wheeled chairs. They were led who could not see. And they smiled and cheered. None of them was whole, but every one was a full man for all that. Audrey cried, shamelessly like Suzanne, but quietly. And not for the first time that day she thought of Chris. She had never loved him, but it was pitiful that he could not have lived. He had so loved life. He would have so relished all this, the pageantry of it, and the gaiety, and the night's revelry that was to follow. Poor Chris! He had thrown everything away, even life. The world perhaps was better that these mutilés below had given what they had. But Chris had gone like a pebble thrown into a lake. He had made his tiny ripple and had vanished. Then she remembered that she was not quite fair. Perhaps she had never been fair to Chris. He had given all he had. He had not lived well, but he had died well. And there was something to be said for death. For the first time in her healthy life she wondered about death, standing here on the Crillon balcony, with the city gone mad with life below her. Death was quiet. It might be rather wonderful. She thought, if Clay did not want her, that perhaps it would be very comforting just to die and forget about everything. From beneath the balcony there came again lustily the shouts of a dozen doughboys hauling a German gun. "Hail, hail, the gang's all here, what the hell do we care, what the hell do we care? Hail, hail, the gang's all here, what the hell do we care now?" Then, that night, Clay came. The roistering city outside had made of her little sitting room a sort of sanctuary into which came only faintly the blast of horns, hoarse strains of the Marseillaise sung by an unvocal people, the shuffling of myriad feet, the occasional semi-hysterical screams of women. "Mr. Spencer is calling," said the concierge over the telephone in his slow English. And suddenly a tight band snapped which had seemed to bind Audrey's head all day. She was calm. She was herself again. Life was very wonderful. Peace was very wonderful. The dear old world, the good old world, the kind, loving, tender old world which separated people that they might know the joy of coming together again. She wanted to sing, she wanted to hang over her balcony and teach the unvocal French the Marseillaise. Yet when she had opened the door she could not even speak. And Clay, too, after one long look at her, only held out his arms. It was rather a long time, indeed, before they found any words at all. Audrey was the first, and what she said astounded her. For she said, "What a dreadful noise outside!" And Clay responded with equal gravity, "Yes, isn't it?" Then he took off his overcoat and put it down, and placed his hat on the table, and said very simply, "I couldn't stay away. I tried to." "You hadn't a chance in the world, Clay, when I was willing you to come." Then there was one of those silences which come when words have shown their absolute absurdity. It seemed a long time before he broke it. "I'm not young, Audrey, and I have failed once." "It takes two to make a failure," she said dauntlessly. "I wouldn't let you fail again, Clay. Not if you love me." "If I love you!" Then he was somehow in that grotesque position that is only absurd to the onlooker, on his knees beside her. His terrible self-consciousness was gone. He only knew that somehow, some way, he must prove to her his humility, his love, his terrible fear of losing her again, his hope that together they might make up for the wasted years of their lives. "I worship you," he said. The little room was a sanctuary. The war lay behind them. Wasted and troubled years lay behind them. Youth, first youth, was gone, with its illusions and its dreams. But before them lay the years of fulfillment, years of understanding. Youth demanded everything, and was discontented that it secured less than its demands. Now they asked but three things: work and peace and love, and the greatest of these was love. Something like that he said to her, when the first inarticulateness had passed, and when, as is the way of a man with the woman who loves him, he tried to lay his soul as well as his heart at her feet. The knowledge that the years brought. That love in youth was a plant of easy growth, springing up in many soils. But that the love of the middle span of a man's life, whether that love be the early love purified by fire, or a new love, sowed in sacrifice and watered with tears, the love that was to carry a man and a woman through to the end, the last love, was God's infinitely precious gift. A gift to take the place of the things that had gone with youth, of high adventure and the lilt of the singing heart. The last gift. End of chapter 50. End of Dangerous Days, by Mary Roberts Rinehart.